The ancient world left behind millions of artifacts, thousands of ruins, and centuries of evidence. Yet some of its biggest mysteries come from things that should be obvious but are not. Why was an enormous monument built where no major population lived? Why did a thriving city suddenly stop growing? Why do certain construction methods appear, disappear, and never return? These are not mysteries hidden in legends. They are questions attached to real places that archaeologists continue to excavate today. And despite advances in dating techniques, satellite mapping, and scientific analysis, many answers remain frustratingly out of reach. The stones are still there, the cities are still there, but the reasoning, decisions, and knowledge behind them are often missing. That is what makes the ancient world so endlessly fascinating. Lochgir Stone Circle is one of the largest and most enigmatic prehistoric monuments ever built in Ireland. Located in County Limerick, beside the waters of Lochgir, this massive stone circle was constructed nearly 4,500 years ago. Yet some of the knowledge required to create it remains difficult to explain even today. The monument, most commonly known as the Grangestone Circle, forms part of a much larger archaeological landscape that contains evidence of human activity stretching back more than 5,000 years. What makes this site remarkable is not merely its age, but the sophisticated planning, engineering, and possible astronomical knowledge hidden within its stones. Unlike many ancient monuments whose purpose is relatively clear, Lochgir continues to raise questions that archaeologists have debated for generations. The modern study of the site began in the 19th century when antiquarians documented the surviving stones and earthworks round Lochgir. Systematic archaeological investigations expanded during the 20th century, particularly through the work of the Irish archaeologist Sean P. O'Riordan and later researchers who revealed the immense complexity of the landscape. Excavations eventually demonstrated that the stone circle dates to approximately 2500 BC, placing it among the major megalithic monuments of northwestern Europe. The first mystery concerns scale. The Grangestone Circle measures approximately 45 meters in diameter and originally contained 113 standing stones, arranged in a nearly perfect ring. The largest stone, known locally as Rannoch Crom Dubh, weighs an estimated 35 to 40 tons. To put that into perspective, the stone weighs roughly as much as a modern military tank. Moving such a block would be difficult even with modern machinery. Yet the builders possessed no iron tools, no cranes, and no wheeled transport systems capable of handling such loads. Archaeologists generally believe the stones were dragged using wooden rollers, ropes, and coordinated human labour. However, theories and demonstrations are not the same as proof. No direct evidence survives showing exactly how the builders transported and erected stones of this size. Comparisons with Stonehenge in England are unavoidable. Stonehenge contains stones weighing up to approximately 25 tons, while some megaliths at Lochgir are even heavier. Both monuments demonstrate that prehistoric communities were capable of organising engineering projects on a scale once thought impossible for societies without written records or advanced technology. The second mystery involves geometry and surveying. Creating a circle 45 meters across may appear simple, but maintaining a consistent radius while positioning more than 100 stones requires careful measurement. Modern surveyors would use lasers, total stations, and digital equipment. The builders of Lochgir had only basic tools made from wood, stone, bone, and plant fibers. Researchers have proposed that the circle could have been laid out using a central stake and a long measuring rope. Even so, maintaining precision across such a large area would require planning and experience. Some archaeologists believe that prehistoric builders may have possessed standardized measurement systems that have left little or no direct archaeological trace. The monument suggests practical, mathematical knowledge far beyond what many people imagine for communities of the late Neolithic period. Yet neither engineering nor geometry represents the greatest mystery of Loch Gur. The most fascinating puzzle involves astronomy. For decades, researchers have noted possible alignments between the stone circle and significant solar events, particularly the summer solstice. Certain stones and openings within the circle appear positioned in ways that may relate to the rising or setting sun during specific times of the year. If these alignments were intentional, their implications are extraordinary. The Earth does not keep the sun in a fixed position on the horizon. Throughout the year, the sunrise and sunset points gradually shift. Tracking these changes requires repeated observations over long periods. To identify the exact position of the summer solstice, observers must monitor the horizon year after year, recording subtle variations in solar movement. Today, this process is straightforward. A smartphone can calculate the sun's position instantly. The builders of Loch Gur possess no clocks, no telescopes, and no written astronomical records. Yet they may have incorporated solar observations into the very architecture of the monument. This raises a fundamental question. How did prehistoric communities acquire and preserve such knowledge? One possibility is that generations of observers carefully tracked celestial cycles over centuries. Another theory suggests that astronomical observations played a practical role in agriculture, helping communities determine seasonal changes critical for planting and harvesting. However, the precision implied by some alignments exceeds what would be strictly necessary for farming. The comparison with Stonehenge becomes particularly relevant here. Stonehenge is famous for its alignment with the summer solstice sunrise. Similar astronomical relationships have been proposed for monuments throughout Britain and Ireland, including Newgrange, where sunlight dramatically illuminates an internal chamber during the winter solstice. Loch Gur may belong to this wider tradition of monumental sky observation. However, unlike Newgrange, where the solar phenomenon is undeniable, the exact purpose of Loch Gur's alignments remains debated. Archaeologists continue to disagree over whether the arrangement reflects intentional astronomical design or whether some apparent alignments are coincidental. The uncertainty itself adds to the mystery. Another unexplained aspect concerns knowledge transmission. Constructing a monument of this scale required expertise in quarrying, transport, surveying, planning, and possibly astronomy. Such knowledge does not emerge spontaneously. It must be taught, refined, and preserved. Yet the builders left no written manuals, diagrams, or inscriptions. This challenge appears repeatedly throughout ancient history. The engineers who built the Egyptian pyramids left few technical explanations. The creators of the Antikythera mechanism produced a machine centuries ahead of its time, while leaving almost no detailed instructions. Roman concrete survived for millennia, yet some aspects of its remarkable durability remain under investigation today. Loch Gur presents a similar problem. We can observe the final product, but the intellectual system behind it has largely disappeared. The landscape around the circle adds another layer of mystery. Loch Gur has long been linked to Irish folklore, with medieval tales describing it as a place of supernatural beings, hidden worlds, and legendary rulers. While not archaeological evidence, these stories show the site remained culturally important long after its builders disappeared. Their persistence suggests later communities viewed the monument as something extraordinary, often attributing such ancient structures to gods, giants, or other supernatural forces. Modern archaeology has answered many questions about Loch Gur. Radiocarbon dating provides approximate construction periods. Excavations reveal settlement patterns. Geophysical surveys map buried features invisible from the surface. Yet the most important questions remain unresolved. Why was such a vast circle necessary? Why invest enormous labour into moving stones weighing tens of tons? Were the alignments intended to track celestial events, or do they reflect something entirely different? How accurate was the builder's understanding of astronomy? And how was that knowledge preserved across generations without writing? The tomb of St. Peter is one of the most investigated burial sites in human history, yet one of its central questions remains unresolved. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City lies a 1st century grave that tradition identifies as the burial place of St. Peter, the apostle believed to have been executed in Rome during the reign of Emperor Nero, around AD 64-67. For nearly 2,000 years, churches, emperors, archaeologists, and scientists have focused on a single question: is the man buried here truly Peter? The answer remains uncertain, and the deeper researchers dig into the evidence, the more complex the mystery becomes. The story begins on Vatican Hill, west of the Tiber River in Rome. During the 1st century AD, this area stood outside the city walls and contained a Roman necropolis built along roads leading from the capital. According to early Christian sources, Peter was crucified during Nero's persecution following the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64. Tradition states that his followers buried him in a simple grave on Vatican Hill. Unlike the monumental tombs of emperors, the alleged burial place was modest and easily overlooked. The modern investigation began almost by accident. In 1939, after the death of Pope Pius V, workers preparing a burial site beneath St. Peter's Basilica encountered ancient structures. Pope Pius V authorized a secret archaeological excavation. Between 1940 and 1949, teams led by archaeologists uncovered an extensive Roman necropolis buried beneath the basilica. What they found transformed understanding of the site. Streets, mausoleums, inscriptions, mosaics, and burial chambers emerged from beneath centuries of construction. Most remarkably, they discovered evidence that the center of Constantine's 4th century basilica had been deliberately aligned with a specific grave. This immediately created the first mystery. Constantine ordered construction of the original basilica around AD 320. Building such a structure on Vatican Hill was an enormous engineering challenge. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of earth were moved to create a stable platform. Large sections of the existing necropolis were buried beneath fill. Yet one small area was preserved precisely at the center of the church. How did Constantine's engineers know exactly where to build? The grave they protected would have been nearly 3 centuries old. No contemporary map survives. No technical documents explain how its location was identified. Somehow, knowledge of a specific burial site appears to have survived for generations with remarkable accuracy. The next mystery involves a structure known as the Trophy of Gaius. Around AD 200, a Roman priest named Gaius wrote that Peter's memorial could still be seen in Rome. During excavations, archaeologists discovered a small monument matching his description. The structure consisted of edicular-like architectural elements erected directly above a grave area. What surprised researchers was not merely its existence but its continuity. The monument appears to have become the focal point around which later construction was organized. In archaeological terms, this is extraordinary. Many ancient burial locations disappeared over time. Yet this particular spot remained important for more than 3 centuries before Constantine built his basilica. The engineering involved raises additional questions. Ancient surveyors achieved an alignment that survived multiple phases of construction. The original Constantinian basilica stood for over 1,000 years before being replaced by the Renaissance structure visible today. Despite radical rebuilding, the central focus remained unchanged. Modern measurements show that the high altar of the current basilica still stands above the same general location identified during excavations. Maintaining that continuity across approximately 17 centuries required an unusual degree of architectural planning and historical memory. Another puzzle concerns the famous Red Wall and the graffiti found nearby. Archaeologists uncovered numerous inscriptions scratched into surrounding surfaces. Some contain Christian symbols. Others appear to reference Peter. The density of markings around this area suggests it attracted pilgrims long before Constantine's basilica existed. This raises a significant question. If early Christians visited the site consistently, how was its location preserved during periods of persecution, political instability, and urban change? The Roman Empire underwent dramatic transformations between the 1st and 4th centuries, yet the tradition identifying this exact place survived. The most controversial mystery emerged from a seemingly insignificant discovery. During the excavations, human bones were found in several locations. Initially, researchers believed one particular set of remains had little significance. The bones had been stored separately and were not immediately associated with the presumed tomb. Years later, however, archaeologist Margherita Guarducci re-examined the evidence. She argued that these bones may have originated from a niche within a wall adjacent to the Trophy of Gaius. If correct, they could potentially belong to Peter himself. This is where the mystery becomes extraordinarily complicated. Scientific analysis revealed that the remains belonged to a male. The individual appears to have been elderly at death, consistent with traditional accounts placing Peter in his 60s or 70s. The bones showed no feet. Some researchers noted that victims of crucifixion were occasionally removed from crosses in ways that could result in missing skeletal elements. The remains were also wrapped in expensive purple cloth, woven with gold thread, suggesting reverence and special treatment. At first glance, the evidence seems compelling, yet every point remains disputed. The bones cannot be identified through DNA analysis, because no verified biological relatives exist for comparison. Unlike Egyptian pharaohs or medieval kings, Peter left no confirmed genetic reference. Radiocarbon dating has limitations because contamination and handling over centuries complicate precise measurement. The remains also lack an inscription explicitly identifying the individual. In forensic terms, no direct proof connects the skeleton to Peter. This creates one of archaeology's most fascinating identification problems. Researchers possess circumstantial evidence, historical tradition, location consistency, and archaeological context. What they lack is definitive confirmation. The situation is often compared to debates surrounding the tomb of Alexander the Great. Historians know Alexander existed, know approximately where he was buried, and possess ancient descriptions of his tomb. Yet the burial itself has never been conclusively identified. Peter's case is different because a tomb exists, but certainty remains elusive. Even the movement of the bones introduces another mystery. Some scholars believe the remains may have been relocated during periods of danger. Others argue they were transferred to protect them from disturbance during construction. If that happened, who moved them? When? Why were no detailed records preserved? The archaeological evidence suggests deliberate handling, but the historical explanation remains incomplete. The site also presents technological questions regarding preservation. The necropolis lies beneath one of the largest churches ever built. Millions of tons of stone, brick, and marble stand above fragile first-century structures. Yet significant portions of the ancient cemetery survived. Engineers continue to study how Roman builders stabilized the area. The challenge resembles other famous ancient construction puzzles. At Machu Picchu, Inca builders created earthquake-resistant, terraces on steep slopes. At the Great Pyramid of Giza, massive stone blocks remain aligned after 4,500 years. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica, Roman and Renaissance engineers somehow preserved a delicate archaeological landscape while constructing monuments of unprecedented scale. Excavations continued throughout the 20th century, producing increasingly sophisticated analyses. Ground surveys, architectural studies, osteological examinations, and historical reviews refined understanding of the site. In 1968, Pope Paul VI announced that the remains identified by Guarducci could be regarded as those of St. Peter. Importantly, this was not a scientific declaration of certainty. Rather, it reflected the conclusion that the available evidence strongly supported the traditional identification. More than 80 years after the first excavations, the central mystery remains unresolved. Archaeological evidence suggests that early Christians venerated this location from a very early period. Constantine's builders believed it marked Peter's grave, and the Trophy of Gaius appears to preserve a tradition reaching back to the 2nd century. The bones belonged to an elderly man and were treated with unusual reverence. Yet none of this proves the identity of the individual beyond doubt. That uncertainty is what makes the tomb of St. Peter so fascinating. Archaeologists have mapped the necropolis, analysed the remains, and studied the inscriptions, but the final answer remains out of reach. The tomb may belong to St. Peter, or it may not. Until stronger evidence emerges, one of history's most important burials will remain one of its greatest mysteries. Do you believe the bones discovered beneath St. Peter's Basilica truly belong to St. Peter, or is the mystery still unsolved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Necropolis of Angelou Ruju is one of the oldest and most enigmatic underground burial complexes in the Mediterranean. Located near Alghero in northwestern Sardinia, Italy, this prehistoric necropolis contains more than 38 rock-cut tombs, carved into sandstone approximately 5,500 to 6,000 years ago. What makes Angelou Ruju remarkable is not merely its age, but the evidence that a Neolithic society, armed with little more than stone tools, created a sophisticated subterranean world whose engineering secrets remain only partially understood today. The site was discovered accidentally in 1903 during quarrying operations near Alghero. Workers extracting stone exposed a hidden chamber beneath the surface. Archaeological investigations soon revealed that this was not a single tomb but an extensive necropolis associated primarily with the Ozieri culture, one of the most advanced prehistoric societies of Sardinia, between roughly 3,200 and 2,800 BC. Excavations eventually uncovered dozens of interconnected hypogea, hundreds of burials, ceremonial artifacts, pottery, stone tools, and traces of ancient pigments. More than a century later, Angelou Ruju continues to raise questions that modern archaeology cannot fully answer. One of the first mysteries concerns the sheer scale of excavation. The tombs were carved directly into sandstone bedrock long before the invention of iron tools. Archaeologists generally believe the builders used stone picks, hammerstones, antler implements, and obsidian blades. Yet the volume of rock removed is astonishing. Some chambers contain multiple rooms connected through carefully cut passageways, while others include niches, benches, pillars, and symbolic architectural features. Creating such spaces required not only enormous labour, but also detailed planning. Unlike a structure built above ground, underground excavation leaves little room for correction. A mistake in alignment could ruin an entire chamber. The question remains: how did Neolithic builders accurately plan complex underground layouts without written plans, metal instruments, or advanced surveying equipment? The second mystery involves architectural imitation. Many chambers were intentionally designed to resemble houses of the living. Archaeologists have identified carved doorways, ceiling beams, pillars, and wall features that serve no structural purpose. Instead, they appear to be stone copies of domestic architecture. This phenomenon is also found in prehistoric hypogea across the Mediterranean, including Malta's Hal Saflieni Hypogeum. However, Archaeological presents some of the most elaborate examples. The builders were not merely creating burial spaces, they were recreating an entire symbolic environment beneath the earth. Why devote such effort to reproducing houses for the dead? Did these people believe the deceased continued to inhabit a parallel world? Or were these chambers part of ceremonies whose meaning has been lost for millennia? A third mystery lies in the false doors carved into the rock. Throughout the necropolis, archaeologists discovered carefully shaped door-like structures that open onto solid stone. These features appear repeatedly across different tombs and were clearly intentional. Similar symbolic doors have been identified in ancient Egypt thousands of years later, where they represented portals between the worlds of the living and the dead. The existence of false doors at Archaeological suggests a sophisticated symbolic system already existed in prehistoric Sardinia, yet no written language survives to explain their meaning. The doors remain among the site's most intriguing unanswered questions. Another puzzle concerns social organization. The construction of Archaeological likely extended across generations. Archaeological evidence suggests the necropolis remained in use for centuries and contained the remains of hundreds of individuals. Managing such a project would have required coordination, leadership, and specialized knowledge. This challenges older assumptions that Neolithic communities were simple and loosely organized. Comparisons with other large prehistoric complexes such as Newgrange in Ireland, built around 3200 BC, and the megalithic temples of Malta suggest that several prehistoric societies possessed organizational abilities far greater than traditionally believed. Yet archaeologists still debate how these communities mobilized labor and transmitted technical knowledge without writing. The greatest technological mystery of Archaeological, however, involves something far less obvious than architecture. It is the color red. Throughout multiple tombs, archaeologists discovered traces of red pigment preserved on walls, ceilings, and burial surfaces. The pigment was primarily red ochre derived from hematite-rich minerals. At first glance, this may not seem extraordinary. Red ochre was widely used in prehistoric burials across Europe, Africa, and the Near East. What makes Archaeological remarkable is the survival of these pigments after more than 5 millennia. In many areas, the red coloration remains visible despite thousands of years of exposure to humidity, temperature fluctuations, microbial activity, and geological change. This longevity has led researchers to investigate how the pigments were prepared and applied. The exact techniques remain uncertain. Ancient artisans likely crushed hematite into fine powder, but the composition of any binding agents remains largely unknown. Some scientists have suggested that organic substances such as animal fat, plant oils, blood, or egg-based compounds may have been used to improve adhesion. However, direct evidence is difficult to recover after thousands of years. The mystery becomes even more fascinating when compared with other prehistoric sites. The cave paintings of Lascaux in France, approximately 17,000 years old, and Altamira in Spain, around 14,000 years old, also employed mineral pigments with extraordinary durability. Yet Archaeological differs because the pigments were applied within enclosed burial chambers, rather than decorated cave galleries. This suggests the red color served a ritual function rather than an artistic one. Many archaeologists believe red ochre symbolized blood, life, rebirth, or regeneration. Similar interpretations have been proposed for burials throughout prehistoric Eurasia. At Ankhelu-Ruju, entire surfaces were sometimes coated with red pigment, creating an environment saturated with symbolic meaning. Some chambers appear to have been intentionally transformed into vivid red spaces where rituals associated with death and renewal occurred. Yet the exact significance remains elusive. Even more puzzling is the possibility that the builders understood practical aspects of mineral preservation. Modern materials science recognizes that iron oxide pigments are chemically stable and resistant to degradation. Although Neolithic people could not have understood the chemistry, they may have acquired generations of empirical knowledge regarding which mineral sources produced the most durable results. The selection, processing, and application of pigments may therefore represent a lost technological tradition rather than simple decoration. The acoustics of the tombs introduce another layer of mystery. Researchers and visitors have noted that some chambers produce unusual resonance effects. Low-frequency sounds can reverberate through enclosed spaces, creating powerful auditory experiences. Similar acoustic phenomena have been documented at Malta's Hal Saflieni Hypogeum and certain megalithic monuments throughout Europe. Whether the builders intentionally designed Ankhelu-Ruju to enhance ritual sound remains uncertain. Nevertheless, the possibility raises intriguing questions about prehistoric understanding of architecture, ceremony, and sensory experience. Excavations throughout the 20th century revealed additional clues but few definitive answers. Archaeologists recovered pottery, figurines, stone tools, ornaments, and human remains that helped establish the chronology of the site. Evidence indicates continued use during later cultural phases, including the Beaker culture. Yet despite advances in radiocarbon dating, microscopic analysis, and digital mapping, fundamental questions remain unresolved. How were the underground chambers planned with such precision? How was technical knowledge transmitted across generations? Why were symbolic architectural features replicated underground? What exactly did the enduring red pigment represent? And how did prehistoric craftspeople produce colors capable of surviving for thousands of years? Karam-Kanesh is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites ever discovered in central Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Nearly 4,000 years ago, this settlement became the commercial heart of an international trade network stretching across more than 1,000 kilometers. Thousands of clay tablets reveal a sophisticated economic system that should not have existed at such an early stage of human history. Yet the greatest mystery of Karam-Kanesh is not its merchants, its wealth, or even its archives. It is the technological knowledge hidden behind its trade empire, especially a question that continues to puzzle archaeologists today. Where did the enormous quantities of tin needed for the Bronze Age actually come from? Located at Kultepe near the modern city of Kayseri in Turkey, Karam-Kanesh flourished during the early 2nd millennium BCE. The settlement consisted of a native Anatolian city and a lower merchant district known as the Karam, where Assyrian traders established a permanent commercial colony. The site first attracted scholarly attention in the late 19th century, but its true significance emerged during excavations led by Turkish archaeologist Tahsin Özgüç, beginning in 1948. Over the following decades, archaeologists uncovered more than 23,000 cuneiform tablets, making Karam-Kanesh one of the largest archives of the ancient world. The discovery transformed historians' understanding of Bronze Age civilization. Before these excavations, ancient trade was often imagined as relatively simple and local. The tablets revealed something entirely different. They documented contracts, investments, loans, shipping records, inheritance disputes, legal agreements, tax payments, and business correspondence spanning multiple generations. The archive exposed a commercial system that in some respects resembles modern international business networks. One of the first mysteries concerns the management of information. The merchants of Kanem-Kanesh operated across vast distances without paper, printing, telecommunication, or centralized databases. Yet they maintained remarkably accurate records of transactions involving silver, textiles, copper, and tin. Individual business partnerships could last for decades and involve multiple investors spread across different cities. Modern economists often compare the complexity of these operations to early corporate structures. Thousands of surviving letters reveal merchants tracking debts, profits, and inventories with impressive precision. The question remains how such a large information network avoided collapse. In the modern world, international commerce depends on computers, telecommunications, and digital accounting systems. 4,000 years ago, every transaction depended on clay tablets, scribes, and human memory. Despite these limitations, the system functioned efficiently for centuries. Another mystery involves communication speed. Messages traveled by caravan through difficult mountain terrain and across hundreds of kilometers of Anatolia and Mesopotamia. A journey between Assur and Kanesh could require several weeks depending on weather and road conditions. Yet the tablets indicate merchants frequently responded to changing prices, political events, and supply shortages. This creates a fascinating puzzle. How did traders maintain relatively synchronized markets despite communication delays that could last months? Modern financial systems rely on near-instant information exchange. The merchants of Kanem-Kanesh achieved surprising levels of coordination without any comparable technology. Some researchers argue that the organizational structure of Assyrian trade networks was far more advanced than previously assumed, perhaps involving highly standardized procedures and trusted intermediary agents. A third mystery lies in security technology. Many contracts were enclosed within clay envelopes bearing cylinder seal impressions. These seals functioned as a form of authentication. If the outer envelope was broken, tampering became immediately visible. In practical terms, Bronze Age merchants had developed an early security system combining identity verification, legal authentication, and document protection. The sophistication of these seals continues to impress researchers. Individual seal designs were often highly distinctive and difficult to replicate. In a world lacking passports, signatures, or electronic verification, these objects provided trust across enormous distances. Some historians have even described them as an ancient equivalent of encrypted commercial identification. The physical organization of Kanem-Kanesh presents another unresolved question. Excavations reveal densely packed merchant houses, storage facilities, workshops, and streets arranged within the lower town. Repeated destruction layers indicate major fires periodically devastated the settlement. Yet after each catastrophe, rebuilding often followed similar patterns. This suggests the existence of urban planning principles that remain poorly understood. How are property boundaries maintained across generations? How are commercial districts organized? What administrative mechanisms regulated construction and reconstruction? The surviving evidence hints at a level of civic organization considerably more sophisticated than many Bronze Age settlements. However, the greatest technological mystery of Kanem-Kanesh concerns metallurgy and the source of tin. Today, bronze seems ordinary. In the Bronze Age, it represented one of humanity's most important technological breakthroughs. Bronze is primarily an alloy of copper and tin. While copper was relatively widespread, tin was exceptionally rare. Without reliable access to tin, entire Bronze Age economies would have struggled to function. The tablets from Kanem-Kanesh repeatedly mention large quantities of tin being transported across long distances. Assyrian merchants imported tin into Anatolia, where it was exchanged for silver and other goods. Historical records indicate that some caravans carried hundreds of kilograms of tin at a time. Over decades, the total volume traded must have reached many tons. Yet the fundamental question remains unanswered. Where did this tin originate? For much of the 20th century, archaeologists lacked a convincing answer. Unlike copper mines, major Bronze Age tin sources are surprisingly difficult to identify. Ancient texts clearly demonstrate extensive tin trade, but the corresponding mining regions often remain uncertain. One theory points eastward towards Central Asia. Deposits in present-day Uzbekistan, Tajikistan and Afghanistan have long been considered possible sources. If this hypothesis is correct, then tin may have travelled thousands of kilometres before reaching Anatolia. Such a route would imply an interconnected trade system spanning a significant portion of Eurasia, nearly 2 millennia before the Silk Road reached its classical form. Another theory focuses on eastern Anatolia and nearby regions. Some researchers argue that local or regional tin deposits may have contributed more significantly than previously believed. Archaeological investigations at several ancient mining sites have revealed evidence of prehistoric extraction, but whether these sources supplied the quantities documented at Karum Kanesh remains uncertain. Recent scientific advances have complicated the picture further. Isotopic analysis allows researchers to compare the chemical signatures of metal artifacts with known ore deposits. Results have sometimes pointed toward multiple potential sources rather than a single origin. This suggests Bronze Age merchants may have acquired tin through a remarkably diverse supply network. The implications are profound. If tin reached Karum Kanesh from the distant Central Asian mines, merchants had mastered logistical systems operating across several ecological zones, political boundaries, and cultural regions. Such coordination would rival some of the most impressive trade networks of the ancient world. Experimental archaeology highlights the challenge. Transporting a heavy cargo across mountainous terrain using pack animals requires careful planning of water supplies, food resources, rest stations, and security arrangements. A single donkey typically carried between 70 and 90 kilograms. Large caravans might include dozens or even hundreds of animals. Maintaining a steady flow of tin into Anatolia would have demanded extraordinary organizational skill. The mystery extends beyond transportation. Ancient metallurgists also needed to identify suitable ores, control furnace temperatures, and produce consistent bronze alloys. Successful bronze production requires balancing copper and tin ratios with considerable precision. Even small variations can affect hardness, durability, and casting behavior. Archaeological evidence suggests Bronze Age metalwork has achieved impressive levels of consistency despite lacking modern instruments. How they developed this expertise remains only partially understood. Their knowledge was likely transmitted through generations of practical experience, yet the technical foundations of their methods remain largely invisible in the archaeological record. Around the 18th century BCE, the commercial network centered on Karum Kanesh began to decline. Researchers believe political instability, warfare, economic disruption, or changing trade routes may have contributed to its downfall, but no definitive explanation has been found. Ironically, the fires that destroyed parts of the settlement also baked thousands of clay tablets, preserving them for nearly 4,000 years. As a result, Karum Kanesh has become one of the most valuable sources of information about trade and commerce during the Bronze Age. Shatili Towers is a fortress village perched nearly 1,400 meters above sea level in the remote Khevsurati region of northeastern Georgia, where dozens of stone towers rise directly from the slopes of the Greater Caucasus Mountains. Few medieval settlements anywhere on Earth combine military architecture, urban planning and environmental engineering in quite the same way. The outside world knew of Shatili for centuries through travellers' accounts, but systematic documentation began during the 19th century when Russian military surveyors mapped the Caucasus frontier. Detailed architectural studies followed throughout the 20th century, revealing that the settlement was not a collection of isolated buildings, but a single integrated defensive system composed of interconnected towers, dwellings, passages, and elevated walkways. Today, researchers continue to study the site because many aspects of its construction remain difficult to explain, using only the technological resources available to its medieval builders. The first mystery begins with the overall design of the complex. Unlike a conventional fortress surrounded by a wall, Shatili itself functions as the fortress. Historical surveys have identified roughly 60 interconnected towers and fortified houses arranged on a steep mountainside. The structures rise between 3 and 5 stories high, creating a dense vertical settlement. What makes this remarkable is that the entire complex appears to have been planned according to defensive principles despite being expanded over generations. The buildings share walls, roofs, observation points, and circulation routes, and in many cases defenders could move through the settlement without exposing themselves to attackers outside. Modern urban planners use computer models to optimize movement through complex environments, yet centuries ago builders in one of the most isolated regions of the Caucasus somehow produced a defensive layout that operated as a unified military machine. Another mystery concerns construction on terrain that seems fundamentally unsuitable for large-scale architecture. The Caucasus Mountains are characterized by steep slopes, unstable ground conditions, freeze-thaw cycles, heavy snowfall, and periodic seismic activity. Many historical settlements built under similar conditions have long disappeared, but Shatili survived. The towers were constructed primarily from locally available slate and stone, materials that had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and assembled without modern machinery. Researchers estimate that thousands of tons of building material were incorporated into the settlement. The question is not merely how the stones were lifted. The greater puzzle is how builders maintained structural stability across a densely packed complex built on uneven terrain. Modern engineers rely on geological surveys, load calculations, and structural simulations. No evidence suggests medieval builders possessed comparable analytical tools, yet many of their structures remained standing for hundreds of years. The third mystery involves communication and battlefield surveillance. Shatili occupied a strategic position near routes connecting northern and southern Caucasus regions. From elevated observation points, defenders could monitor movement through surrounding valleys long before potential enemies approached the settlement itself. The towers function not only as residences, but also as watchposts integrated into a broader defensive network. Researchers studying visibility patterns have noted that the placement of several towers appears highly optimized for observation. This raises an intriguing question. How did builders determine the most effective locations without modern topographic mapping equipment? Today, military planners use satellite imagery, drones, and geographic information systems to evaluate lines of sight. Medieval builders somehow achieved impressive observational coverage using only direct knowledge of the landscape. The fourth mystery centers on logistics. Even in the 21st century, reaching Shatili can be difficult. Roads crossing the Caucasus are frequently affected by weather, landslides, and seasonal closures. Yet medieval communities transported enormous quantities of stone, timber, food, tools, and construction materials into this remote mountain environment. Archaeologists have found no evidence for large cranes, advanced lifting systems, or sophisticated transport infrastructure. Nevertheless, a substantial fortified settlement emerged in a location where modern construction would still present significant challenges. Similar questions surround famous sites such as Machu Picchu in Peru, where researchers continue debating how large quantities of material were moved across difficult terrain. Chantilly presents a comparable logistical puzzle on a smaller but equally demanding scale. Perhaps the most fascinating mystery of all involves ventilation and temperature control. Winters in Kiev-Surety are harsh. Temperatures can fall well below freezing, snowfall can accumulate heavily, and strong mountain winds can make exposed locations extremely uncomfortable. At an elevation of approximately 1,400 meters, maintaining habitable indoor conditions would have been a constant challenge. Yet Chantilly remained occupied for centuries. The towers reveal architectural choices that appear surprisingly sophisticated. Windows are generally small, exterior walls are thick, openings are carefully positioned, and multiple floors are arranged vertically, often with livestock traditionally occupying lower levels and living quarters located above. At first glance, these may seem like ordinary features of mountain architecture. However, when viewed as a complete system, they suggest a highly effective strategy for thermal management. Modern building science demonstrates that thick masonry walls possess significant thermal mass. Such walls absorb heat slowly and release it gradually, reducing temperature fluctuations. Small window openings minimize heat loss and limit exposure to cold winds. The vertical organization of space may have provided additional benefits because heat naturally rises. Warmer air generated by animals, fireplaces, and human activity on lower floors would tend to move upward through the structure. In effect, the towers may have functioned as passive heating systems long before the scientific principles involved were formally understood. What remains unexplained is the extent to which these outcomes were intentional. Did generations of builders gradually discover the most efficient designs through trial and error, or did they inherit architectural knowledge refined over centuries? Researchers have proposed that subtle airflow patterns inside the towers helped regulate indoor environments during both winter and summer, yet comprehensive scientific studies remain limited. Unlike famous Roman heating systems, Chantilly left behind no written manuals, engineering diagrams, or technical descriptions. The knowledge exists only in stone. Comparisons with other mountain settlements highlight the uniqueness of the achievement. Medieval alpine villages in Europe often relied heavily on timber construction, while Tibetan highland communities adapted to extreme environments using different architectural traditions. The stone tower complexes of Svaneti in western Georgia share certain similarities with Chantilly, but differ significantly in urban organization. Chantilly represents a rare combination of defensive architecture and environmental adaptation integrated into a single settlement. Modern researchers now employ laser scanning, drone photogrammetry, structural analysis software, and advanced conservation techniques to understand the settlement. These tools provide unprecedented insight into its architecture. Yet some of the most important questions remain unanswered. Researchers continue to ask how construction standards were maintained over generations, how builders optimized airflow and thermal performance without scientific instruments, how observation networks were designed so effectively, and how much architectural knowledge disappeared when traditional building practices declined. Zernaki Tepe is an archaeological mound in southeastern Turkey, near the Upper Tigris Basin, a region that served as a crossroads between Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Caucasus for thousands of years. Despite its relative obscurity compared with sites such as Göbekli Tepe or Troy, Zernaki Tepe presents a different kind of mystery. Beneath its layers of soil lies evidence of engineering knowledge, resource management, and metallurgical expertise that remain only partially understood. Archaeologists have excavated settlements, architectural remains, and traces of industrial activity, yet some of the most important technological questions still have no definitive answers. The site was identified through archaeological surveys conducted in the Tigris region during the 20th century, with subsequent excavations revealing multiple occupation layers spanning different periods of prehistory and antiquity. Like many Near Eastern tells, Zernaki Tepe was formed by centuries of rebuilding, where each generation constructed new structures atop older ones, gradually creating an artificial hill. What initially appeared to be a simple mound eventually proved to be a complex record of long-term human occupation. One of the first mysteries concerns settlement planning. Ancient communities in the upper Tigris Basin often occupied uneven terrain, yet excavations have revealed surprisingly organized architectural layouts. Walls, streets, and domestic structures frequently follow consistent orientations despite repeated rebuilding episodes over centuries. This raises an important question. How did ancient builders establish and preserve spatial organization without modern surveying equipment? Today, engineers use levels, laser instruments, satellite positioning, and digital mapping. The inhabitants of Zernaki Tepe relied entirely on manual observation and simple tools. Yet many ancient settlements across the Near East demonstrate a degree of planning that suggest practical surveying methods far more sophisticated than commonly assumed. Water management presents another technological puzzle. The upper Tigris region experiences strong seasonal variations in rainfall. Agricultural success depended on controlling water availability throughout the year. Archaeological evidence from nearby settlements demonstrates the use of drainage systems, storage facilities, and irrigation infrastructure designed to regulate water flow. Similar systems throughout Mesopotamia often required gradients measured with remarkable precision. Modern hydraulic engineers understand that even small errors in slope can dramatically affect performance. A channel that descends too steeply erodes its banks. A channel that descends too slowly accumulates sediment and eventually fails. The question remains how ancient engineers determined these gradients with sufficient accuracy. Comparable mysteries surround the aqueducts of Rome and the canal systems of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, where water was transported across vast distances with extraordinary efficiency. Yet perhaps the most fascinating mystery associated with Zernaki Tepe involves metallurgy. Throughout the ancient Near East, metal production represented one of humanity's most demanding technological achievements. Archaeological investigations across southeastern Turkey and northern Mesopotamia have uncovered furnaces, slag deposits, tuyères, crucibles, and metal artifacts, indicating extensive metallurgical activity. Sites within the broader Tigris region participated in networks that transformed raw ores into valuable tools, weapons, and trade goods. At first glance, ancient metalworking may appear relatively straightforward. In reality, it requires precise control over multiple variables simultaneously. Iron production, for example, demands temperatures approaching 1,200 degrees Celsius. Achieving such temperatures without electricity, modern refractory materials, or scientific measuring devices represents a remarkable engineering accomplishment. Furnace operators had to understand airflow dynamics, fuel characteristics or quality, and thermal behavior through experience alone. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated how difficult this process actually is. Modern researchers attempting to recreate ancient bloomery furnaces frequently encounter failure despite possessing extensive scientific knowledge. Slight changes in furnace geometry, charcoal composition, moisture content, or airflow rates can dramatically alter the final result. Some experiments produce only partially reduced ore. Others generate unusable slag, instead of workable metal. The fact that ancient metallurgists consistently produced functional iron suggests an accumulated body of practical knowledge that has largely disappeared. The volume of slag discovered at many ancient metallurgical sites often indicates production far beyond local household needs. In some Near Eastern settlements, slag deposits reach thousands of kilograms, suggesting organized industrial activity. Such production would have required not only technical expertise but also coordinated labor systems, or had to be mined, transported, processed, and smelted. Charcoal production alone demanded significant quantities of wood. Studies estimate that producing a single kilogram of bloom iron could require several kilograms of charcoal, creating substantial logistical challenges for ancient communities. This leads to one of the most intriguing questions surrounding sites such as Zernaki Tepe. How were these production systems organized? There is no evidence for modern engineering schools, technical manuals, or standardized industrial procedures. Yet metallurgical operations often maintained consistent quality across generations. Knowledge appears to have been transmitted through apprenticeship and direct experience. Entire technological traditions survived for centuries without written instructions. The furnaces themselves present another mystery. Excavated furnace remains often appear deceptively simple. However, computer modeling and experimental reconstruction have shown that many ancient furnace designs created highly effective airflow patterns. Some structures functioned almost like natural draft systems, increasing combustion efficiency without mechanical assistance. Similar discoveries have been made in studies of African iron furnaces, Roman smelting facilities, and early Anatolian metallurgical workshops. What seems primitive at first glance frequently reveals sophisticated engineering principles hidden within simple forms. Researchers also continue to debate how ancient metallurgists identified suitable ore deposits. Modern mining operations rely on geological surveys, chemical analysis, and remote sensing technology. Ancient prospectors possessed none of these tools. Nevertheless, they consistently located economically viable mineral sources. Across Anatolia and Mesopotamia, evidence suggests that metalworkers recognized visual indicators, geological formations, and perhaps even subtle environmental clues that are poorly documented today. Much of this practical geological knowledge may have vanished entirely. Another unresolved mystery concerns trade networks. Metal production required access to resources that were often geographically separated. Ore deposits, fuel sources, and population centers rarely existed in the same location. Archaeological evidence indicates that materials moved across distances of hundreds of kilometers. Obsidian, copper, tin, and finished metal goods circulated through extensive exchange systems linking distant communities. Long before formal states developed sophisticated bureaucracies, these networks already connected vast regions of the ancient Near East. The scale of these interactions becomes even more remarkable when compared with other ancient technological centers. Bronze Age trade routes stretch from Afghanistan to Mesopotamia. Copper from Anatolia traveled across enormous distances. Tin, one of the rarest and most essential components of bronze production, often originated hundreds or even thousands of kilometers from manufacturing centers. The logistics required to sustain such systems rival some of the most impressive achievements of later civilizations. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not how these technologies were created, but how so much knowledge disappeared. The people who lived at Zernaki Tepe understood construction, water management, resource extraction, metallurgy, and long-distance trade. Their expertise allowed communities to survive in challenging environments for centuries. Yet almost none of their technical explanations remain. No engineering textbooks have been recovered. No manuals describe furnace construction. No detailed records explain how surveyors measured landscapes or how metallurgists optimized production. Perched on a rocky promontory approximately 150 meters above sea level, at Cape Bon in northeastern Tunisia, the fortress overlooks the narrow maritime corridor between North Africa and Sicily. For centuries it controlled shipping routes linking the central and western Mediterranean. Yet beyond its military history lies a deeper mystery. Archaeologists can explain who occupied the site and roughly when its walls were expanded, but many of the engineering principles that allowed the fortress to survive for more than 1,000 years remain only partially understood. The site occupies a location that appears almost impossibly ideal. From the summit, observers can monitor vast stretches of coastline and sea approaches. Long before aerial surveys, satellite imagery, or modern cartography, ancient builders somehow selected one of the most advantageous defensive positions in the entire region. Similar questions are often asked about Masada in Israel, the Acropolis of Athens, and the fortress of Narinkala in Dagestan. In each case, ancient engineers identified terrain that maximized visibility, defense, and access to resources. How these locations were systematically surveyed remains one of the less appreciated mysteries of ancient engineering. The fortress was already known locally for centuries, but modern archaeological investigations accelerated during the 20th century as researchers began documenting its Byzantine, Islamic, and Ottoman phases. Excavations and architectural studies revealed that the visible structure represents multiple construction periods layered upon one another. This discovery transformed Kilibia from a regional historical monument into a valuable laboratory for studying long-term military engineering in the Mediterranean world. The first major mystery involves the fortress's structural endurance. The Mediterranean coast is one of the most destructive environments for masonry architecture. Salt-laden winds penetrate stone pores, moisture expands and contracts with seasonal temperature changes, and centuries of storms continuously erode exposed surfaces. Yet large sections of Kilibia's walls remain standing despite these conditions. Some defensive walls measure several meters in thickness and continue to preserve their original geometry after hundreds of years of exposure. Researchers studying ancient fortifications have long observed that survival is rarely accidental. Successful defensive architecture reflects sophisticated understanding of load distribution, foundation stability, and material behavior. At Kilibia, the arrangement of walls, towers, and retaining structures suggests a practical knowledge of structural mechanics that predates modern engineering theory by centuries. Builders had no finite element models, no computer simulations, and no standardized engineering manuals. Nevertheless, they created a fortress capable of resisting gravity, weathering, seismic activity, and warfare over exceptionally long periods. A second mystery concerns logistics. Constructing a major fortress atop a steep coastal promontory required moving enormous quantities of stone uphill. Even conservative estimates suggest that thousands of tons of material were transported to the summit during various construction phases. Ancient builders faced the same fundamental challenge encountered at Machu Picchu, the Great Pyramid of Giza, and the hilltop fortresses of the Caucasus. Archaeologists understand the general principles of ramps, rollers, animal traction, and human labor, but the precise methods employed at Kilibia remain unknown. No complete construction records survive. No engineering diagrams explain how materials were raised and positioned. The physical evidence demonstrates the achievement, while the process itself remains largely invisible. The third and perhaps most fascinating mystery involves the fortress mortar. This question has attracted growing attention because the durability of many surviving walls appears disproportionate to their age. In numerous locations throughout the Mediterranean, ancient mortars have displayed longevity that rivals or even exceeds some modern materials. Roman concrete structures such as the Pantheon have survived nearly 2,000 years. Marine concrete used in ancient Roman harbours continues to resist seawater after centuries of immersion. Calibia presents a related puzzle. Microscopic examinations of ancient Mediterranean mortars have shown that their strength often derives from complex chemical interactions occurring over long periods. Rather than simply binding stones together, some mortars continue evolving after construction. Minerals crystallize, microfractures become partially sealed, and chemical reactions gradually strengthen the material. Recent studies of Roman marine concrete reveal the presence of rare mineral formations such as aluminous tobermorite, which can improve durability in seawater environments. These discoveries have forced scientists to reconsider assumptions about ancient material technology. At Calibia, researchers have identified lime-based mortars combined with local aggregates, but many details remain uncertain. The exact composition varies between construction phases, suggesting that builders may have adapted recipes according to specific structural requirements. Some sections exposed directly to marine conditions appear remarkably resistant to deterioration. This raises several unresolved questions. Did the builders possess empirical knowledge of additives that improved durability? Were certain sands, clays, or mineral inclusions deliberately selected? Did generations of craftsmen transmit specialized formulas that were never written down? Experimental archaeologists attempting to reproduce ancient mortars frequently discover that seemingly simple materials conceal extraordinary complexity. Small changes in firing temperatures, aggregate size, lime quality, or curing conditions can dramatically alter performance. Ancient builders may not have understood the chemistry in modern scientific terms, but centuries of observation could have produced highly effective construction practices. The fortress walls of Calibia may therefore preserve evidence of practical material science whose full sophistication is still being uncovered. Another unresolved issue involves water management. A fortress occupying a high rocky outcrop cannot survive prolonged sieges without reliable water supplies. Archaeological surveys have identified cisterns and collection systems designed to capture rainfall. Yet questions remain regarding storage capacity and efficiency. How many inhabitants could these systems support? How are losses from evaporation minimized? Could the fortress sustain a large garrison during extended military crises? Similar debates surround desert fortresses throughout North Africa and the Near East, where hydraulic engineering often determined whether a settlement survived or failed. The fortress also raises questions about surveying technology. Ancient builders had to establish foundations on uneven rock, align walls across irregular terrain, and maintain structural stability over considerable distances. Modern engineers perform these tasks using lasers, GPS equipment, and advanced measuring instruments. The architects of Calibia relied on far simpler tools. Nevertheless, the surviving geometry indicates consistent planning and execution. Comparable achievements can be observed at Roman military sites, Hellenistic fortifications, and Byzantine strongholds throughout the Mediterranean basin. The recurring pattern suggests that ancient surveyors possessed practical techniques more sophisticated than their surviving tools might imply. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not the fortress itself, but the disappearance of the knowledge behind it. Calibia demonstrates expertise in surveying, logistics, defensive architecture, hydraulic engineering, and material science. The structure remains, the walls remain, the mortar remains, yet the technical traditions that produced them have largely vanished. No manuals explain the precise construction sequence. No surviving documents reveal the complete material recipes. No engineer's notebook records the calculations behind the design. Muang Boran is located in Samut Prakan, Thailand, and although it is a modern historical park established in 1963, it preserves scaled reconstructions of some of Southeast Asia's most important ancient sites. Behind these replicas lies a deeper archaeological mystery: how the civilizations of ancient Thailand and pre-Angkor Southeast Asia developed sophisticated engineering, metallurgy, and urban technologies centuries before many researchers once believed possible. The story begins with discovery, not of Muang Boran itself, but of the ancient civilizations it represents. Throughout the 20th century, archaeologists working across Thailand uncovered buried cities, moated settlements, metallurgical workshops, temple complexes, and extensive hydraulic systems. Excavations at sites associated with the Dvaravati culture, dating roughly from the 6th to the 11th centuries AD, revealed urban centres covering several square kilometres. Aerial surveys later showed that many of these settlements were not random villages but carefully planned cities surrounded by enormous circular or oval earthworks. Some measured more than 2 kilometers across. The scale immediately raised questions. How did ancient surveyors establish such precise layouts without modern instruments? What mathematical principles guided their designs? And who organized the labor required to reshape landscapes on such a massive scale? One of the first mysteries concerns urban planning itself. Ancient Dvaravati settlements such as Nakhon Pathom and Yu Thong display geometric layouts that suggest centralized planning rather than gradual organic growth. Archaeologists have compared some of these city plans to large-scale earthworks elsewhere in the ancient world. Similar to the geometric enclosures of Iron Age Europe or the carefully planned ceremonial centers of Mesoamerica, these Southeast Asian cities required sophisticated knowledge of measurement and land management, yet no surviving texts explain how their planners worked. The builders left behind cities but almost no technical manuals. Water management presents an even greater puzzle. Central Thailand experiences dramatic seasonal variation. During the monsoon, rivers can overflow vast areas of the floodplain. During dry months, water becomes a critical resource. Despite these challenges, ancient populations supported large urban centers for centuries. Excavations have uncovered extensive networks of canals, reservoirs, embankments, and artificial waterways. Some systems stretch for many kilometers. Modern hydrologists studying these landscapes have noted that successful operation would have required careful control of gradients, water flow, and seasonal storage. Even slight errors could have produced catastrophic flooding or drought conditions. Yet the ancient engineers achieved remarkable results without modern surveying equipment, concrete structures, or mechanical pumps. The mystery becomes more intriguing when compared with other ancient hydraulic civilizations. The Khmer Empire at Angkor developed one of the largest water management systems in human history, covering more than 1,000 square kilometers. Ancient Sri Lankan kingdoms constructed reservoirs capable of storing hundreds of millions of cubic meters of water. While Thailand's systems were generally smaller, they reveal similar engineering principles. This raises a major question. Were these technologies independently developed, or did knowledge spread through networks connecting ancient South and Southeast Asia? Archaeologists continue to debate the answer. Another unresolved mystery involves astronomical knowledge. Several reconstructed temples represented within Muang Boran originate from cultures influenced by Indian, Mon, and Khmer traditions. Studies of ancient temples across Thailand have revealed that many structures exhibit deliberate orientation patterns. Some align closely with cardinal directions. Others may correspond to solar events or symbolic cosmological concepts. The challenge is determining how ancient builders achieved such accuracy. Establishing true north without modern compasses requires repeated observations of celestial objects. Such observations demand expertise accumulated over generations. Yet once again, the technical knowledge behind these achievements largely vanished. The engineering of stone monuments raises further questions. Throughout mainland Southeast Asia, builders transported enormous quantities of sandstone and laterite. Individual blocks could weigh several tons. In some cases, quarry sites were located tens of kilometers from construction zones. Researchers studying Khmer monuments have proposed transportation systems involving canals, rafts, sledges, and seasonal waterways. However, many details remain uncertain. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that moving such stones was possible, but recreating the scale achieved by ancient builders remains extremely difficult. Similar debates surround the construction of the Egyptian pyramids, the stone terraces of Machu Picchu, and the megaliths of Baalbek. Ancient Southeast Asia belongs within the same broader conversation about lost engineering knowledge. Yet perhaps the most fascinating mystery represented by the ancient cultures preserved through Unbroken concerns metallurgy. The story begins long before Angkor emerged as a regional power. Excavations across Thailand have revealed evidence for remarkably early metalworking traditions. Sites such as Ban Chiang transformed scholarly understanding of Southeast Asian technological history. Early investigations suggested bronze production may have begun in parts of the region as early as the 2nd millennium BC. While dating debates continue, there is no doubt that complex metallurgical knowledge existed centuries before the rise of major classical states. Metal production appears simple when viewed from a modern perspective. In reality, ancient metallurgy represents one of humanity's most sophisticated technological achievements. Producing bronze requires precise control over alloy composition. Copper and tin must be combined in specific proportions. Too little tin produces soft metal, too much creates brittleness. Ancient craftsmen achieved reliable results without chemical laboratories, thermometers, or written engineering manuals. The challenge became even greater with iron. Iron smelting demands temperatures approaching 1,200 degrees Celsius. Reaching such conditions requires carefully designed furnaces, high-quality charcoal, controlled airflow, and suitable ore selection. Every variable influences the final product. Archaeological excavations across Thailand have uncovered slag deposits, furnace remains, tuyeres, and iron artifacts, demonstrating that ancient metalworkers mastered these processes on a significant scale. The unanswered question is how they acquired this knowledge. Some scholars argue that metallurgical technology spread southward from China. Others propose influences from South Asia. A growing number of researchers suggest that local innovation played a larger role than previously assumed. The evidence remains incomplete. Ancient furnaces rarely preserve detailed clues about operating procedures. Unlike modern factories, they leave behind only fragments of their technological secrets. The scale of production creates additional mysteries. At several Southeast Asian sites, slag accumulations indicate repeated large-scale smelting over long periods. Such production required organized labor, reliable fuel supplies or procurement networks, and technical specialists. These were not isolated craftsmen working occasionally. They were part of sophisticated economic systems. Yet archaeologists still struggle to reconstruct how these systems were organized. Experimental archaeologists attempting to recreate ancient furnaces have encountered unexpected difficulties. Seemingly simple furnace designs often conceal highly complex airflow dynamics. Small changes in furnace height, wall thickness, or tuyere angle can dramatically alter temperatures inside the combustion chamber. Modern experiments frequently require numerous failed attempts before achieving results comparable to ancient examples. This suggests that ancient metalworkers possessed practical knowledge accumulated through generations of observation and experimentation. The comparison with other ancient metallurgical centers is striking. African iron smelting traditions, early Chinese blast furnace technologies, and Near Eastern bronze industries all demonstrate that pre-industrial societies could achieve extraordinary technical sophistication. Southeast Asia increasingly appears to belong within this group. Rather than being a peripheral recipient of technology, the region may have been an active center of innovation. Perched on a mountain ridge overlooking the southeastern shores of Lake Sevan in modern-day Armenia, Udzhaberd stands as a remarkable example of ancient engineering and military architecture. The fortress belonged to the Kingdom of Urartu, one of the most powerful Iron Age civilizations of the Near East. More than 2,700 years after its construction, massive stone walls still dominate the landscape, raising questions that archaeologists and engineers have yet to fully answer. How did a civilization operating in the 8th and 7th centuries BC transport enormous quantities of stone onto such difficult terrain, construct durable fortifications in an earthquake-prone region, sustain military garrisons on a remote mountain, and develop an iron industry capable of supporting one of the most formidable armies of its age? The ruins were documented by scholars during the 19th and early 20th centuries as archaeological exploration expanded across the Caucasus. Later excavations connected the site to the Eurasian defensive network that once controlled strategic routes around Lake Sevan. While the discovery itself was straightforward, the technologies hidden within the ruins proved far more difficult to explain. The first mystery begins with location. Udzhaberd occupies a naturally defensible mountain position hundreds of meters above the surrounding terrain. From the fortress, observers could monitor vast stretches of the basin and detect movement across important routes approaching Lake Sevan. Such a position offered enormous military advantages, but it also created a logistical challenge. Every block of stone, every timber beam, every weapon, and every supply item had to be transported uphill. Archaeologists estimate that thousands of tons of construction material were required to build the surviving fortifications alone. Unlike the Egyptians, who could exploit the Nile for transportation, the builders of Udzhaberd worked in a mountainous environment where moving heavy loads was considerably more difficult. No surviving records explain how these logistics were organized, leaving researchers to reconstruct the process from the archaeological evidence alone. The fortress walls themselves present another puzzle. Large basalt blocks were assembled into defensive structures capable of surviving nearly 3 millennia of weathering, erosion, and seismic activity. Armenia lies within a tectonically active region that has experienced destructive earthquakes throughout history. Yet, significant sections of Eurasian masonry remain standing. Engineers studying ancient stone architecture often compare such structures to the earthquake-resistant masonry of Machu Picchu in Peru, or certain fortifications of the Hittites in Anatolia. Although Udzhaberd lacks the precisely interlocking polygonal masonry of the Inca, its builders clearly understood how to exploit local geology, bedrock stability, and wall geometry to maximize durability. The absence of formal engineering texts makes it difficult to determine whether this knowledge resulted from centuries of experimentation or from a sophisticated architectural tradition that has largely disappeared. Another mystery involves surveying technology. The placement of the fortress was not random. The builders selected a position that maximized visibility while minimizing vulnerable approaches. Modern military planners rely on satellite imagery, digital elevation models, and geographic information systems to perform similar analyses. Eurasian engineers possessed none of these tools, Yet the fortress demonstrates a remarkable understanding of terrain optimization. Researchers studying Eurasian fortifications have noted that many strongholds were positioned to create overlapping zones of observation. This has led to the hypothesis that Odzibird formed part of a broader communication network linking multiple fortresses throughout the kingdom. If signals using fire or smoke could be transmitted between sites, military warnings might have travelled across large distances within hours. The exact structure of this network remains uncertain, but the strategic placement of Eurasian fortresses suggests a level of regional planning far more advanced than often assumed. Water management presents another unresolved question. A fortress isolated on elevated terrain cannot function during a siege without reliable access to water. Across the Eurasian kingdom, archaeologists have uncovered reservoirs, canals, and sophisticated hydraulic systems. Some Eurasian canals transported water for dozens of kilometers. The famous Menua Canal, for example, extended approximately 72 kilometers and continued functioning in modified form for centuries. Such achievements demonstrate extraordinary hydraulic expertise. At Odzibird, however, the precise methods used to secure water supplies remain incompletely understood. Evidence suggests the collection and storage of water, but the full system has not survived. This leaves open the question of how large garrisons maintain themselves during prolonged periods of isolation. The military significance of the fortress introduces another technological mystery. Urartu emerged as one of the dominant powers of the Near East during the 9th to 7th centuries BC, competing with Assyria, arguably the most militarized empire of the era. Assyrian inscriptions describe campaigns against Urartu involving large armies, siege operations, and fortified cities. To resist such opponents, Urartu required more than strong walls. It needed weapons, armor, tools, transportation equipment, and a steady supply of metal. This leads directly to what may be the most fascinating mystery associated with Odzibird and the wider Eurasian state: metallurgy. The rise of Urartu coincided with the expansion of iron technology across the Near East. Iron transformed warfare because it enabled the production of stronger weapons and more durable tools than many earlier bronze equivalents. Yet ironworking is far more complicated than it appears. Producing usable iron requires temperatures approaching 1,200 degrees Celsius, careful management of fuel, precise airflow control, and knowledge of ore characteristics. Even small changes in furnace design can dramatically affect results. Modern experimental archaeologists attempting to reproduce ancient iron smelting techniques often discover that seemingly simple furnaces conceal surprisingly sophisticated engineering principles. Excavations throughout former Eurasian territory have uncovered evidence of extensive metalworking activity, including slag deposits, furnaces, iron artifacts, bronze objects, and mining operations. These discoveries indicate that metallurgy formed a cornerstone of the kingdom's military and economic power. What remains difficult to explain is how Eurasian metalworkers achieved such consistency without modern scientific knowledge. They possess no thermometers, no chemical analyses, no metallurgical textbooks, and no mathematical models describing combustion processes. Nevertheless, they repeatedly produced weapons and tools capable of equipping armies and supporting large-scale construction projects. One of the most intriguing aspects of ancient metallurgy involves furnace efficiency. Maintaining temperatures above 1,100 degrees Celsius requires an optimized relationship between charcoal quality, furnace geometry, ore composition, and airflow. Bellows must deliver sufficient oxygen to sustain combustion without cooling the furnace. The dimensions of the furnace chamber influence heat retention and gas circulation. The selection of ore affects impurity levels and final metal quality. Modern metallurgical engineers understand these relationships through centuries of scientific research. Urartian smiths learned them through observation and experience. The question is how such knowledge was accumulated, transmitted, and standardized across an entire kingdom. Comparisons with other ancient civilizations make the achievement even more impressive. Egyptian civilization excelled in monumental stone construction, but never developed an iron industry on the scale seen in later Iron Age societies. The builders of Stonehenge demonstrated remarkable logistical capabilities but left little evidence of advanced metallurgy. The Roman Empire eventually achieved industrial-scale mining and metal production, yet much of that development occurred centuries after Urartu reached its peak. In terms of chronology, Urartian ironworking belongs to a critical period when humanity was still learning to master one of the most important technologies in history. The mystery deepens because the knowledge itself has largely vanished. The furnaces are ruined, the workshops are fragmented, the craftsmen left few written explanations. Archaeologists can analyze slag chemistry, reconstruct furnace dimensions, and examine surviving artifacts under microscopes. But these methods reveal results rather than processes. The practical expertise that allowed Urartian metallurgists to transform rock into weapons may have depended on generations of accumulated experience that disappeared when the kingdom declined during the late 7th century BC. Perched roughly 600 meters above the Moquegua Valley on a steep-sided mesa, more than 2,400 meters above sea level, Cerro Baal became one of the most extraordinary strongholds of the weary civilization. Even today, standing on its summit raises a simple question. How did an ancient society build and sustain a city in a place that seems designed to prevent human settlement? The site is located in the Moquegua region of southern Peru. Archaeologists identified Cerro Baal as a major Wari center during 20th century surveys, but systematic excavations accelerated in the late 1980s and continued through major projects led by archaeologists, including Ryan Williams and Donna Nash. Their discoveries revealed that this isolated mesa was not merely a fortress, but a political, ceremonial, and industrial center occupied between approximately AD 600 and AD 1000 during the expansion of the Wari Empire, one of the earliest large-scale states in the Andes. The first mystery is the mountain itself. Unlike many ancient cities that developed near rivers, fertile plains, or trade routes, Cerro Baal occupies the summit of a nearly inaccessible mesa surrounded by cliffs. Reaching the top requires traversing narrow routes that would have challenged even modern transport. Yet archaeologists discovered residential compounds, administrative buildings, storage facilities, ceremonial spaces, and industrial installations. The logistical challenge is staggering. Every stone used in construction, every wooden beam, every ceramic vessel, and every kilogram of food had to be carried uphill. Unlike later colonial societies, the Wari possessed no wheeled transportation system for hauling cargo and no draft animals comparable to horses or oxen. Their largest transport animal, the llama, can typically carry loads of only 20 to 30 kilograms. This creates a transportation puzzle comparable to those surrounding Machu Picchu, Sacsayhuaman, and the fortress of Masada in Israel. However, Cerro Baal predates Machu Picchu by several centuries and demonstrates that large-scale mountaintop urban planning already existed in the Andes long before the rise of the Inca. The second mystery involves water. The mesa contains no major natural water source capable of sustaining a permanent population. Yet archaeological evidence indicates long-term occupation lasting approximately 4 centuries. Such a settlement required water, not only for drinking but also for food preparation, craft production, sanitation, religious ceremonies, and industrial activities. Researchers believe the inhabitants relied on engineered systems connected to springs and irrigation networks in the surrounding landscape. However, many components have disappeared through erosion and later disturbance. The surviving evidence suggests sophisticated hydraulic planning, but the exact mechanisms remain uncertain. This uncertainty is significant because water management often determines whether a city survives or collapses. Comparable engineering achievements can be seen at Petra in Jordan, where channels and reservoirs captured desert runoff, and at Machu Picchu, where carefully designed drainage systems still function after centuries. Cerro Ball appears to belong in the same category of advanced ancient hydraulic environments. The third mystery, and perhaps the most remarkable of all, is the industrial brewery on the summit. Excavations uncovered evidence that Cerro Ball housed a large-scale facility dedicated to producing chicha, a fermented corn beer that played a central role in Andean political and religious life. The scale of production shocked researchers. Archaeologists discovered specialized brewing rooms, large ceramic fermentation vessels, grinding installations, storage areas, and botanical remains associated with beverage production. Analysis suggests that production exceeded the needs of individual households and operated at a scale associated with state-sponsored events. This transforms Cerro Ball from a remote fortress into something far more complex, a mountaintop industrial center. At first glance, brewing may seem technologically simple. In reality, fermentation is an extremely sensitive biological process. Successful production requires precise control of ingredients, preparation methods, temperatures, timing, cleanliness, and storage conditions. Even modern brewers rely heavily on standardized procedures because small variations can dramatically affect results. The mystery is how Wari brewers achieve consistency without thermometers, clocks, chemical testing equipment, or written technical manuals. To produce large quantities of chicha, workers had to process vast amounts of maize. Corn had to be cultivated in surrounding valleys, transported uphill, processed, fermented, stored, and distributed. Every stage required coordination. Some researchers estimate that ceremonial feasts could involve hundreds of participants. Such gatherings would demand substantial volumes of beverage. The logistical calculations become extraordinary. Water, fuel, labor, raw materials, and ceramic containers all had to be managed simultaneously on a mountain summit. The brewery also reveals a deeper political mystery. Throughout history, states have often used food and drink to reinforce authority. Ancient Egypt distributed bread and beer to laborers. Roman leaders organized public feasts. In the Andes, chicha served as both a ritual beverage and a political tool. The Wari may have used massive brewing operations to strengthen alliances, reward loyalty, and display power. If true, Cerro Ball was not merely producing alcohol, it was manufacturing political influence. Yet many technical questions remain unanswered. How were fermentation conditions controlled in an environment with large daily temperature fluctuations? How did brewers maintain quality across repeated production cycles? How was spoilage minimized? How did they acquire enough fuel for heating and processing on a mountaintop with limited resources? Experimental archaeologists have attempted to recreate ancient Andean brewing methods and discovered that many apparently simple processes require extensive practical knowledge. The brewery at Cerro Ball suggests generations of accumulated expertise that were never written down and are now largely lost. The fourth mystery concerns an unusual geopolitical situation. Cerro Ball stood near the frontier between the Wari state and the Tiwanaku civilization, another major power of the ancient Andes. In many regions of the ancient world, such proximity between rival states resulted in repeated warfare. Yet archaeological evidence indicates that both societies occupied neighbouring territories for centuries. This has led researchers to debate whether the relationship involved competition, coexistence, diplomacy, trade, or combination of all four. Cerro Ball may represent one of the earliest examples in South America of a stable frontier between complex states. The fifth mystery emerged at the end of the site's history. Around AD 1000, Wari influence declined across the Andes. At Cerro Ball, however, the inhabitants did not simply abandon the city. Archaeological excavations uncovered evidence of enormous final feasts followed by deliberate destruction of important structures. Ceramic vessels were smashed, buildings were burned. Certain spaces appear to have been intentionally closed forever. The pattern does not resemble military conquest, it resembles ritual termination. Researchers believe the inhabitants consciously ended the life of the city before departing. Why they chose this course remains uncertain. Perhaps it marked the collapse of political authority. Perhaps it represented a religious ceremony. Perhaps it symbolized the conclusion of a centuries-long occupation. Whatever the explanation, the event transformed Cerro Ball into a time capsule. How do you think the Wari managed to operate an industrial brewery on top of a remote mountain for centuries? Share your theory in the comments below. Kirkapole Chapels is one of the most overlooked archaeological mysteries in the North Atlantic. Standing on the small island of Tiree in the Inner Hebrides of western Scotland, the site appears modest at first glance. Ruined stone chapels, weathered grave markers, and scattered foundations overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Yet beneath these ruins lies a remarkable puzzle. For centuries, generations of builders, stonemasons, and religious communities created and maintained sophisticated structures on an isolated island, exposed to some of Europe's harshest weather. Today, archaeologists can study the surviving stones, but many of the engineering methods, surveying techniques, and construction traditions behind Kirkapole remain uncertain. Located near the northern coast of Tiree, approximately 130 kilometres west of mainland Scotland, Kirkapole occupies a strategic position within a maritime landscape that connected Scotland, Ireland, and the wider North Atlantic world. The site contains the remains of medieval chapels, burial grounds, and some of Scotland's most important carved grave slabs. Despite centuries of coastal erosion, Atlantic storms, and human activity, significant portions of the site have survived. The archaeological importance of Kirkapole became increasingly recognised during the 19th and 20th centuries as historians and antiquarians documented its carved stones and ecclesiastical remains. Subsequent excavations revealed evidence of multiple phases of occupation, suggesting that the site remained significant for several centuries. While many medieval churches survive across Britain, Kirkapole presents a unique opportunity to study how a relatively small island community develops sophisticated religious architecture far from major political and economic centres. One of the first mysteries concerns the durability of the construction itself. Tiree is one of the windiest inhabited islands in the United Kingdom. Meteorological records show frequent Atlantic storms, high salt exposure, and persistent coastal erosion. These conditions accelerate the deterioration of stone structures, yet portions of Kirkapole's masonry survived for centuries. The builders achieved this without modern cement, steel reinforcement, or advanced engineering calculations. Archaeologists studying medieval masonry often find that longevity depends not only on materials, but also on understanding local geology, drainage, and structural load distribution. The survival of Kirkapole suggests that its builders possessed practical engineering knowledge adapted specifically to the island environment. This raises an important question. How did medieval builders on an isolated island acquire and transmit such knowledge? There are no surviving construction manuals from Kyrkopol. The expertise appears to have been preserved through apprenticeship, oral tradition, and accumulated experience. Once these traditions disappeared, much of the knowledge vanished with them. A second mystery surrounds the remarkable carved grave slabs associated with the site. Kyrkopol is particularly famous for its medieval sculpture, including depictions of warriors, clergy, and religious symbols carved with impressive precision. Some slabs display artistic quality comparable to monuments found in much larger ecclesiastical centres. Producing such works required more than artistic talent. Stone carving demands specialised tools, understanding of stone properties, and years of training. The precision visible in many Kyrkopol carvings suggests the presence of highly skilled craftsmen. Yet Tyre's population during the medieval period was relatively small. Historians continue to debate whether these craftsmen were local specialists, members of travelling workshops, or artisans connected to wider networks stretching across Scotland and Ireland. Similar questions arise at major medieval sites such as Iona, where artistic traditions appear to have spread through interconnected religious communities. The exact mechanisms behind this transfer of technical knowledge remain poorly understood. Another mystery involves transportation and logistics. Every construction project depends upon moving materials. Stone had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and assembled. Tools, food supplies, and skilled labour also had to be supported. Modern observers often underestimate the difficulty of such operations in pre-industrial island environments. Even relatively small structures can require hundreds of tons of stone. Without motorized vehicles, cranes, or mechanized lifting equipment, every stage depended on human effort and careful planning. Experimental archaeology has repeatedly demonstrated that moving heavy stone blocks requires sophisticated organization rather than brute force alone. Whether constructing Stonehenge, transporting Easter Island statues, or building medieval churches, success depends on coordination, engineering judgment, and efficient use of manpower. The builders of Kyrkopol clearly possessed these abilities. The question is how such organizational knowledge developed within a remote island community and how it was sustained across generations. The most fascinating mystery, however, concerns the orientation of the chapels themselves. Many early Christian churches throughout Europe follow an east-west alignment. Traditionally, the altar was placed toward the east, symbolically associated with the rising sun and Christian theology. Kyrkopol appears to follow this broader pattern. At first glance, such alignment may seem straightforward. In reality, achieving consistent orientation without modern instruments presents a significant technical challenge. Today, surveyors use GPS receivers, digital compasses, satellite imagery, and laser equipment. Medieval builders possessed none of these technologies, yet across Britain and Ireland, archaeologists repeatedly encounter churches aligned with remarkable consistency. How was this accomplished? One possibility is direct solar observation. By carefully tracking sunrise positions during particular times of year, builders could establish an approximate east-west axis. However, sunrise positions shift significantly throughout the year due to Earth's axial tilt. The difference between summer and winter sunrise positions can exceed 60 degrees at northern latitudes. Determining true east, therefore, requires more sophisticated observations than simply watching the sun rise. Another possibility involves astronomical surveying. Ancient and medieval builders may have used stellar observations to establish directional references. Throughout history, numerous civilizations relied on stars for navigation and orientation. Egyptian pyramid builders achieved astonishing cardinal alignments thousands of years earlier. The Great Pyramid of Giza deviates from true north by only a fraction of a degree. While Kyrkopol's builders were not attempting such extreme precision, the broader principle remains relevant. astronomical observation can produce surprisingly accurate results. Some researchers suggest that medieval builders may have used simple geometric techniques. By tracking shadows cast by a vertical pole known as a gnomon, surveyors can estimate cardinal directions with reasonable accuracy. This method requires no advanced technology but does require mathematical understanding and careful observation. The mystery deepens because orientation patterns vary slightly among medieval churches. Some alignments appear connected to local topography. Others may correspond to feast days, patron saints, or specific sunrise events. Determining whether Kyrkopol's orientation reflects practical surveying, religious symbolism, astronomical observation, or a combination of all three remains difficult. Unlike written records, stone foundations do not reveal the reasoning behind their placement. Archaeologists can measure the results, but often cannot reconstruct the exact decision-making process. A fifth mystery concerns maritime connectivity. Tyre's isolation is deceptive. During the medieval period, the sea functioned as a transportation network rather than a barrier. Boats connected communities across Scotland, Ireland, and the Hebrides. Maintaining these connections required extensive nautical knowledge. Mariners needed to understand tides, currents, seasonal weather patterns, and celestial navigation. The North Atlantic is among the world's most demanding maritime environments. Even modern vessels face significant challenges during severe weather. Yet religious communities repeatedly established and maintained settlements across these islands. The existence of Kyrkopol suggests participation in broader cultural and religious networks, whose practical operation remains only partially understood. But what do you think? How did the builders of Kyrkopol manage to preserve such sophisticated knowledge on a remote Atlantic island? And why was that knowledge eventually lost? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your theories. Garafa Megalithic Park is located in the Gore River Valley of Granada province in southern Spain. More than 240 megalithic tombs, known as dolmens, are scattered across the arid hills and ravines of the region, making it one of the largest concentrations of prehistoric funerary monuments in Europe. Archaeological investigations conducted throughout the 20th century revealed that many of these structures were built between approximately 3000 and 1800 BC, during the late Neolithic and Bronze Age. At first glance, Garafi appears to be little more than a collection of ancient stone tombs. Yet the site presents a series of technological mysteries that continue to challenge archaeologists, engineers, and landscape researchers. How did prehistoric communities construct hundreds of megalithic monuments across difficult terrain? How did they transport multi-ton stones without metal machinery? Why were the tombs positioned with such remarkable consistency? And how did this knowledge survive for more than 1,000 years before disappearing completely? One of the first puzzles begins with the landscape itself. Unlike the fertile river valleys that supported many early civilizations, the Garaf region is relatively dry and rugged. Deep ravines cut through the terrain, creating a dramatic but challenging environment. Yet, for over a millennium, prehistoric communities repeatedly selected this landscape as the location monumental construction. The scale of the effort is astonishing. More than 240 known dolmens have been identified, and some researchers believe additional structures remain undiscovered beneath sediment and vegetation. This concentration rivals many famous megalithic regions of Europe. The question is simple but difficult to answer: why here? Transporting construction materials through steep valleys would have required enormous labor. Organizing repeated building projects over centuries would have demanded stable social systems and long-term planning. Yet the reasons that made this landscape so important remain uncertain. Some archaeologists suggest that the valley held religious significance. Others believe its position along prehistoric travel routes may have transformed it into a ceremonial centre. Neither explanation fully accounts for the extraordinary density of monuments concentrated in a relatively confined area. Perhaps the most surprising discovery is that the tombs do not appear to have been placed randomly. Modern geographic information system analysis has revealed that many dolmens occupy carefully selected positions overlooking the valley. Their placement often maximizes visibility across the landscape while maintaining strategic relationships with neighboring monuments. Such patterns raise a remarkable possibility. The builders may have possessed sophisticated surveying skills thousands of years before formal mathematics emerged in Europe. Today, engineers use laser rangefinders, satellite positioning systems, and digital terrain models to identify optimal construction locations. The people of Gorufe possessed none of these technologies, yet they repeatedly selected sites that appear carefully integrated into the surrounding landscape. Researchers still do not know how these decisions were made. Did specialized surveyors exist within prehistoric communities? Were positions determined through astronomical observations? Did generations of builders inherit mapping traditions that left no written record? The answers remain elusive. Every megalithic site in Europe confronts archaeologists with the same question: how were enormous stones transported? At Gorufe, some of the capstones and supporting slabs weigh several tons. Moving a single stone of this size using only human labor is an immense logistical challenge. Moving hundreds of them over centuries is something else entirely. Experimental archaeology provides partial clues. Modern reconstructions suggest that wooden rollers, sledges, ropes made from plant fibers, and coordinated teams of workers could move large stones over short distances. However, these experiments often involve modern planning, modern safety procedures, and a complete understanding of the intended outcome. The builders of Gorufe accomplished these tasks repeatedly without written engineering manuals. Researchers still debate fundamental questions. How many workers participated in each project? How were transport routes prepared? Were temporary roads constructed? How were slopes negotiated without catastrophic accidents? No definitive answers have emerged. The same mystery appears at Stonehenge in England, where some stones travelled more than 200 kilometres, and at the Carnac alignments in France, where thousands of standing stones were erected across the landscape. Gorufe belongs to this larger tradition of prehistoric engineering achievements, whose practical methods remain only partially understood. A dolmen may appear simple, vertical stone supporting a horizontal capstone. In reality, the structure presents complex engineering challenges. A capstone weighing several tons exerts enormous forces on the supporting slabs. Slight errors in positioning can create uneven stress distributions capable of causing collapse. Ground stability, weight transfer, and stone geometry all influence long-term survival. Yet many Gorufe monuments have remained standing for 4,000 to 5,000 years. This is particularly impressive when considering environmental conditions. The region experiences significant temperature fluctuations, seasonal rainfall, erosion, and occasional seismic activity associated with southern Spain's tectonic setting. Modern structural engineers can analyze such problems using computer simulations. The prehistoric builders relied entirely on experience. What remains mysterious is how that experience became so effective. Did builders learn through generations of experimentation? Did master craftsmen transmit construction techniques orally? How were successful designs identified and standardized? The monuments themselves demonstrate that the builders understood structural behavior remarkably well. The process by which that understanding developed remains largely unknown. One of the most debated topics surrounding Gorufe involves astronomy. Numerous megalithic monuments across Europe exhibit alignments connected to solar or lunar events. Newgrange in Ireland famously illuminates its interior chamber during the winter solstice. Stonehenge contains alignments associated with the midsummer sunrise. Some researchers have proposed that certain Garaf dolmens may also display preferred orientations, particularly toward the east and southeast. If true, the implications would be profound. Such alignments would suggest systematic observation of celestial cycles and the integration of astronomical knowledge into funerary architecture. However, the evidence remains controversial. Critics argue that local topography may explain many orientations. Others believe the statistical patterns are too consistent to be accidental. Modern computer modeling has improved the precision of alignment studies, yet definitive conclusions remain elusive. Were the builders tracking the sun? Were they observing seasonal changes important for agriculture? Or are modern researchers imposing patterns onto structures whose original purpose was entirely different? The mystery remains unresolved. Perhaps the greatest technological puzzle is not the monuments themselves, but the society capable of producing them. The construction of a single dolmen requires planning, labor coordination, resource acquisition, transportation, and specialized knowledge. The construction of more than 240 monuments over roughly 1,000 years requires something far more complex. Knowledge had to be preserved across generations. Construction techniques had to remain reliable. Communities had to mobilize workers repeatedly, and ceremonial traditions had to survive political, environmental, and demographic changes. This suggests a level of social organization often underestimated in prehistoric Europe. The people of Garafe were not merely isolated farmers placing stones in the ground. They were participants in a long-term cultural system capable of preserving technical knowledge for centuries. Yet virtually none of that knowledge survives in written form. Narikala Fortress dominates the skyline of Tbilisi, Georgia. Perched on steep ridges above the Kura River, this ancient stronghold has guarded the city for more than 1,500 years. Archaeologists believe the earliest fortifications appeared around the 4th century AD, though the site was expanded repeatedly by Persians, Byzantines, Arabs, Mongols, and Georgian kingdoms. Despite centuries of warfare, earthquakes, and environmental erosion, large portions of the fortress still remain. The ruins are well known to tourists, yet Narikala presents a technological mystery that receives far less attention than famous sites such as Machu Picchu, Masada, or the Great Wall of China. The real puzzle is not who built it. The mystery is how ancient engineers managed to construct and maintain such a massive defensive complex on terrain that appears almost impossible for large-scale construction. Modern archaeology has revealed parts of the story, but many engineering questions remain unanswered. The first mystery begins with location. Narikala was not constructed on a flat plateau. It occupies steep volcanic ridges overlooking Tbilisi, with some sections positioned hundreds of meters above the surrounding valley. Even today, transporting construction materials to certain areas of the fortress would be challenging. Yet ancient builders moved thousands of tons of stone uphill and created walls extending across uneven mountain terrain. This raises a fundamental engineering question. How were the materials transported? No evidence exists for advanced lifting machinery comparable to modern cranes. Historical records provide little information about construction methods. Researchers believe workers relied on human labor, animals, ramps, sledges, and simple mechanical devices. However, the exact logistics remain unknown. The challenge becomes even more impressive when compared with other mountain fortresses. At Machu Picchu in Peru, Inca builders transported stones across steep Andean slopes without wheels. At Masada in Israel, Roman engineers built enormous siege ramps using hundreds of thousands of tons of rock and earth. Narikala belongs to this category of ancient projects where the scale of construction appears disproportionate to the available technology. The fortress demonstrates that ancient builders possessed a sophisticated understanding of terrain, stability, and construction logistics, even if the details of their methods have been lost. Georgia sits within one of the most tectonically active regions of Eurasia. The collision between the Arabian and Eurasian tectonic plates generates frequent seismic activity throughout the Caucasus. Historical records document numerous destructive earthquakes affecting the region. One of the most significant occurred in 1827, causing severe damage to parts of Narikala. Yet, remarkably, substantial sections survived. This creates another mystery. Why did so much of the fortress remain standing? Modern engineers know that masonry structures are particularly vulnerable to seismic forces. Earthquake-resistant design normally requires flexibility, energy dissipation, and carefully engineered load distribution. Ancient builders possessed none of the mathematical models used by modern structural engineers. Yet many surviving walls continue to stand after centuries of seismic stress. Researchers studying ancient fortifications have noted that some traditional construction techniques unintentionally improve earthquake resistance. Thick walls, carefully interlocked stone blocks, flexible mortar mixtures, and strategic placement on bedrock can all contribute to structural survival. Similar questions surround other ancient sites. The Inca walls of Peru demonstrate remarkable seismic resistance. Certain Roman structures have survived major earthquakes for nearly 2 millennia. Narikala may represent another example of practical engineering knowledge that builders developed through generations of observation and experience rather than formal science. Exactly how much these builders understood remains uncertain. Perhaps the most fascinating technological mystery involves the material holding the fortress together. Ancient mortar appears simple. In reality, it is often one of the most complex components of historical construction. Researchers investigating long-lasting structures frequently discover that ancient builders developed highly effective mixtures adapted to local environments. Roman marine concrete remains one of the most famous examples. Scientific studies have shown that some Roman harbour structures survived nearly 2,000 years in seawater because unusual mineral reactions strengthened the material over time. Narikala raises similar questions. What exactly was used in its mortar? How were ingredients selected? How did builders determine optimal ratios? The fortress has endured centuries of rain, temperature fluctuations, biological weathering, warfare, and seismic activity. While repairs and reconstructions occurred throughout its history, surviving sections suggest that original materials possessed considerable durability. Laboratory analysis has identified typical components such as lime and local aggregates. However, archaeologists still cannot fully reconstruct the practical knowledge that ancient masons used to produce consistent results generation after generation. The recipe may be partially understood, but the expertise behind it is not. Another puzzle concerns the remarkable placement of the fortress itself. Narikala occupies positions that maximize visibility across the Kura River Valley. From its highest points, defenders could monitor movement through critical approaches to the city. Observation towers and walls appear carefully integrated into the surrounding landscape. Today, military planners use topographic maps, satellite imagery, drones, and computer simulations to optimize defensive positions. Ancient engineers had none of these tools, yet they consistently selected locations that provided extraordinary tactical advantages. How? Surveying instruments in antiquity were relatively simple. Builders relied on measuring rods, plumb lines, sighting devices, and accumulated experience. Nevertheless, the fortress demonstrates an understanding of line-of-sight geometry that appears remarkably sophisticated. The same mystery appears elsewhere. The designers of Iron Age hill forts in Europe, Urartian fortresses in Armenia, and Byzantine strongholds across Anatolia frequently achieved near-optimal defensive placement without modern technology. Narikala provides another example of engineering competence that exceeds what many people expect from pre-modern societies. A fortress cannot survive a siege without water. This simple fact creates one of Narikala's greatest unresolved questions. Historical sources indicate that the fortress possessed access to water storage systems. Archaeological evidence suggests the existence of cisterns and infrastructure associated with water management. However, many details remain unclear. How much water could be stored? How long could defenders survive under siege? How was water transported to elevated sections of the fortress? Supplying water to mountaintop settlements has challenged civilizations throughout history. The Nabateans of Petra constructed sophisticated hydraulic systems in desert environments. The Byzantines built enormous underground reservoirs in Constantinople. The Incas developed intricate mountain water channels. Narikala likely relied on similarly impressive solutions, yet much of the original infrastructure has disappeared. As a result, researchers can only partially reconstruct how the system functioned. Most fortresses are built during a single historical period. Narikala is different. Over roughly 15 centuries, successive civilizations expanded, repaired, modified, and reinforced the fortress. Persian rulers added defensive features. Arab governors transformed portions of the complex. Medieval Georgian kingdoms introduced further improvements. Each generation inherited existing structures built by previous cultures. This presents a major engineering challenge. Modern architects often struggle when modifying old buildings because incomplete knowledge of original designs creates structural risks. Ancient builders faced the same problem. Yet Narikala continued evolving for centuries without catastrophic failure. How did later engineers understand the structural behavior of earlier construction? How were repairs integrated into aging walls? How were weaknesses identified and corrected? Few written records survive to answer these questions. Perched on a remote mountain ridge in southern Georgia, near the modern border with Armenia, Gagi Fortress overlooks a landscape that has witnessed centuries of conflict and cultural exchange. Today, only ruined walls, scattered stone blocks, and the remains of medieval structures survive. Archaeologists identified the site through historical records, field surveys, and excavations that link the fortress to the powerful Kingdom of Armenia during the reign of King Gagik I, around the late 10th and early 11th centuries. Yet the ruins quickly revealed a mystery, as parts of the fortress appeared older than the historical accounts describing its construction. More than 1,000 years later, researchers still debate whether Gagi was entirely built by King Gagik I, or whether he inherited and expanded an even older military complex. That question marks the beginning of one of the most overlooked technological mysteries in the Caucasus. Historical sources attribute the fortress to King Gagik I, one of the most influential rulers of medieval Armenia. However, archaeological evidence suggests that certain foundations may predate the known construction phase. This possibility raises important questions. If earlier fortifications existed on the site, who built them? The Caucasus has been occupied by numerous civilizations, including Urartians, Armenians, Iberians, Persians, Byzantines, Arabs, and various local kingdoms, and many ancient strongholds were rebuilt repeatedly over centuries. Researchers studying Gagi have found evidence of multiple construction phases, suggesting that the fortress evolved over time rather than appearing all at once. This pattern resembles famous sites such as the Citadel of Aleppo, whose foundations span more than 4,000 years of occupation, or Derbent Fortress in Dagestan, where successive empires continuously modified earlier defensive systems. Yet unlike those sites, Gagi remains only partially excavated, leaving its earliest origins uncertain. The true age of the fortress may be significantly older than the surviving historical records suggest. One of the first things that surprises modern engineers is the strategic precision of Gagi's location. The fortress occupies elevated terrain overlooking important valleys and historical transportation corridors connecting Armenia and Georgia. Military analysts studying ancient fortifications often note that elevation dramatically increases defensive effectiveness, as a defender positioned on high ground gains greater visibility, longer reaction times, and significant advantages against attacking forces. Modern geographic modelling demonstrates that observation posts located on elevated ridges can monitor movement across dozens of square kilometres. Yet, medieval builders had no satellite imagery, no aerial surveys, and no digital terrain models. How did they identify such strategically optimal locations? This question appears repeatedly throughout ancient history. The builders of Masada selected a desert plateau with nearly perfect defensive characteristics, while the creators of Machu Picchu chose a mountain ridge protected by steep slopes and natural barriers. The architects of Gagi appear to have applied similar principles. Their decisions suggest sophisticated knowledge of terrain analysis long before modern cartography existed. Perhaps the most fascinating technological mystery involves the fortress walls themselves. Unlike modern military structures built according to standardized geometric plans, Gagi's defenses adapt continuously to the surrounding landscape. The walls follow irregular ridges, cliffs, and natural rock formations, rather than forcing the terrain to conform to a rigid design. This approach offered major advantages. Every meter of natural cliff reduced the amount of wall that needed to be constructed, every rocky outcrop became part of the defensive system, and every natural obstacle increased the difficulty of an assault. Modern military engineers recognize this principle as force, multiplication through terrain integration. However, achieving such integration requires detailed understanding of geology, slope stability, load distribution, and structural behavior. The builders had no engineering software, no surviving blueprints, and no written manuals explaining their methods. Yet the remaining structures demonstrate an advanced ability to combine architecture with topography. One of the greatest unsolved problems concerns logistics. The fortress required thousands of tons of stone, and even relatively small medieval fortifications often consumed several thousand cubic meters of masonry. Assuming an average density of approximately 2,600 kilograms per cubic meter for local stone, the total material involved could easily have reached tens of thousands of tons. Transporting such quantities across mountainous terrain would have been an enormous challenge. Modern construction projects rely on cranes, trucks, hydraulic equipment, and mechanized excavation, but the builders of Gagi possessed none of these technologies. Researchers believe they likely used combinations of wooden rollers, animal traction, earthen ramps, sled systems, and large labor forces, yet the exact methods remain unknown. This mystery echoes similar questions surrounding the Great Pyramid of Giza, the walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, and the giant fortifications of Urartu. Across the ancient world, civilizations repeatedly demonstrated logistical capabilities that continue to impress modern engineers, and Gagi belongs to that tradition. Every fortress faces the same problem. Walls alone cannot guarantee survival. Water determines whether defenders can withstand a siege. Historical sieges throughout Eurasia often lasted weeks, months, or even years, and during such conflicts, access to water frequently became the deciding factor. Yet the visible remains of Gargi reveal little about its original water infrastructure. Researchers suspect that the fortress once relied on sophisticated systems, including rainwater harvesting, underground cisterns, storage reservoirs, and carefully managed drainage networks. Comparable systems existed elsewhere in the region. The fortress of Masada stored millions of litres of water in massive cistern complexes, while Crusader castles throughout the Levant employed elaborate collection systems capable of sustaining large garrisons. The unanswered question is whether Gargi possessed similar hydraulic engineering. If so, much of that infrastructure has either collapsed or remains buried beneath centuries of debris. The Caucasus lies within one of the world's most tectonically active regions. Modern geological studies show that earthquakes have repeatedly affected southern Georgia and neighbouring Armenia throughout recorded history. This creates an important puzzle. How did Gargi survive for centuries in such an environment? Many surviving sections reveal thick masonry walls and construction techniques that appear designed to distribute loads efficiently. Researchers studying medieval Caucasian architecture have observed that some builders employed flexible masonry arrangements, carefully selected stone sizes, and specific bonding patterns that improved resilience. The same principle can be seen in Inca stonework at Machu Picchu and Sacsayhuaman, where structures survived numerous earthquakes that damaged later buildings. Whether Gargi incorporated comparable seismic adaptations remains an active area of investigation. The surviving ruins suggest that its builders understood structural behaviour far better than often assumed. A fortress rarely operated alone. Many medieval strongholds functioned as components within larger defensive networks. Researchers believe Gargi may have participated in a chain of observation points and fortifications distributed across the region. Such systems depended on line-of-sight communication. Signals could be transmitted using fire beacons, smoke signals, reflective surfaces, and mounted messengers. Some ancient communication networks transmitted warnings across hundreds of kilometers within hours. The Byzantine beacon system described by medieval sources stretched across Anatolia, and the Great Wall of China employed similar signaling methods. Could Gargi have been part of an equally sophisticated regional warning network? The evidence remains incomplete, but its strategic position strongly suggests that communication played a central role in its design. Dolmen de Bagneux stands near the city of Saumur in western France's Loire Valley. Archaeologists identified the monument during early antiquarian surveys of the region, where it quickly gained attention for its extraordinary size. Dating suggests the structure was built roughly between 4000 and 3000 BC, making it older than Stonehenge and older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. More than 5,000 years later, the monument remains standing, raising questions that modern archaeology and engineering have not fully answered. At first glance, Dolmen de Bagneux appears to be a simple stone tomb. In reality, it is among the largest surviving dolmens in Europe. The burial chamber measures approximately 18 meters in length and more than 4 meters in width, while massive upright stones support enormous capstones, some weighing an estimated 20 to 25 metric tons. These figures immediately present a challenge because the builders possessed no iron tools, no cranes, no pulleys, no wheeled transport capable of moving such loads, and no written engineering manuals. Yet they successfully transported, positioned, and stabilized stones, weighing as much as modern military vehicles. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that moving a 20-ton stone using only wooden rollers and human labor is theoretically possible. However, theoretical possibility is not the same as a practical explanation. Researchers still cannot fully reconstruct the exact methods used at Dolmen de Bangneur. Questions remain about how these enormous stones were extracted, transported across uneven terrain, and lifted into position with enough precision to create a stable structure that has survived for 5 millennia. The monument remains one of Europe's most impressive examples of prehistoric heavy engineering. Perhaps the first engineering challenge was not transportation but extraction. The monument stones were obtained from local geological formations, yet separating multi-ton blocks from bedrock using Neolithic technology presents enormous difficulties. Modern quarrying depends on steel tools, explosives, hydraulic systems, and diamond cutting equipment, none of which existed when Dolmen de Bangneur was built. Archaeologists believe Neolithic workers may have used stone hammers, antler picks, wooden wedges, and controlled fracturing techniques. One hypothesis suggests that wooden wedges were inserted into natural cracks and soaked with water so that, as the wood expanded, pressure gradually split the rock. The concept itself is simple, but the scale is not. Producing dozens of precisely shaped blocks weighing many tons would have required extensive knowledge of rock behavior, fracture mechanics, and geological weaknesses. Even today, researchers debate how prehistoric builders achieved such consistent results without written technical knowledge. The mystery resembles challenges seen at Stonehenge in England, the Carnac megaliths in Brittany, and Newgrange in Ireland, where enormous stones were manipulated with technologies that remain only partially understood. Transportation may be the greatest mystery of all. Some of the stones at Dolmen de Bangneur weigh more than 20 metric tons, and moving such loads even a few kilometers presents a formidable engineering challenge. Modern calculations indicate that a stone weighing 25 tons generates roughly 245,000 newtons of force due to gravity. Reducing friction sufficiently for transport would require carefully designed rollers, sledges, lubricated surfaces, or combinations of all three. Yet no direct evidence survives. No preserved transport routes have been identified, no construction diagrams exist, and no written records describe the process. Researchers have attempted experimental reconstructions using teams of volunteers, and these experiments show that hundreds of people could potentially move large stones under favourable conditions. However, scaling these demonstrations to match the dimensions of Dolmen de Bangneur remains difficult. The problem becomes even more complicated when elevation changes, weather conditions, and ground stability are considered. The monument demonstrates that Neolithic societies possessed logistical capabilities far greater than traditionally assumed. Perhaps the most remarkable fact about Dolmen de Bangneur is that it still stands. 5,000 years is an extraordinary lifespan for any structure. The monument has survived thousands of seasonal temperature cycles, continuous groundwater fluctuations, soil movement, storms and erosion, as well as human activity. Unlike modern buildings, the dolmen contains no concrete, steel reinforcement, mortar, or mechanical fasteners. The stones simply support one another through geometry and weight distribution. Engineers studying megalithic structures often note that their builders displayed a surprisingly advanced practical understanding of structural stability. The placement of support stones appears carefully chosen to distribute loads across multiple contact points, reducing localized stress and improving long-term stability. What remains unclear is how such knowledge was acquired. Did builders learn through centuries of experimentation? Did specialist construction traditions exist? Were master builders transmitting technical expertise across generations? No one knows. The monument preserves the result, but not the engineering process behind it. Another puzzle involves planning and measurement. The chamber extends in a remarkably straight line for approximately 18 meters, and the supporting stones maintain a coherent arrangement despite being individually irregular. This suggests that the builders employed some form of surveying system. Modern construction relies on measuring tapes, levels, geometric calculations, and standardized units, while Neolithic builders possessed none of these in recognizable modern forms. Yet archaeological evidence across Europe increasingly suggests that prehistoric societies could achieve surprising levels of accuracy. At Stonehenge, alignments correspond to solar events. At Newgrange, sunlight illuminates the interior chamber during the winter solstice. Across Brittany, megalithic complexes reveal evidence of large-scale planning. Dolmen de Bagneux may represent another example of forgotten surveying knowledge. The mystery is not whether prehistoric people could measure. The mystery is how they measured so effectively. The monument also raises questions about social organization. Building Dolmen de Bagneux required more than engineering, it required management. Large numbers of workers had to be coordinated, food had to be supplied, and quarrying teams, transport crews, and construction groups had to operate together. Some estimates suggest that constructing major megalithic monuments may have required thousands of workdays. For comparison, similar organizational challenges appear at Stonehenge, where researchers estimate that transporting the largest stones involved hundreds of people. At the Great Pyramid of Giza, modern studies suggest labor forces numbering in the tens of thousands. Dolmen de Bagneux is smaller than those monuments, but the underlying logistical principles are remarkably similar. The structure suggests that Neolithic communities were capable of planning and executing projects on a scale once thought impossible for prehistoric societies. Archaeologists generally classify Dolmen de Bagneux as a burial monument, yet this explanation may not tell the entire story. Many megalithic monuments served multiple functions simultaneously. They could act as burial places, ritual centers, territorial markers, gathering locations, or symbols of social identity. The sheer scale of Dolmen de Bagneux raises an important question. Why invest such enormous effort merely to create a tomb? The monument's dimensions exceed what would be necessary for simple burial purposes. Some researchers argue that the structure may have served as a visible demonstration of communal power, technological capability, or social cohesion. If so, Dolmen de Bagneux represents not only an engineering achievement, but also an early example of monumental architecture used to communicate authority and identity. Smatterberg Fortress stands on a narrow mountain ridge more than 2,000 meters above sea level in the Vyots-Dzior region of southern Armenia. Archaeologists have studied the site since the 19th century, but despite decades of investigation, many of its most remarkable engineering secrets remain unresolved. The fortress occupies one of the most strategically powerful locations in the Caucasus, where steep cliffs protect most approaches while the summit provides commanding views across the surrounding valleys. Yet this extraordinary position raises a question that still challenges historians and engineers today. How was such a massive fortress built in a place where transporting materials would have been an enormous logistical challenge? The first mystery begins with the fortress itself. Smatterberg stretches across a mountain ridge that is naturally difficult to access even today. The surviving fortification walls extend for hundreds of meters and in some sections reach several meters in thickness. Thousands of tons of stone were required to create these defenses. Modern engineers examining the site face a difficult question. How were these stones transported to such an extreme location? The problem becomes more intriguing when considering the technological limitations of the medieval period. There were no motorized vehicles, no modern cranes, and no paved mountain roads. Every block had to be quarried, moved, lifted, and positioned using human labor, animals, and simple mechanical systems. The challenge resembles famous construction mysteries elsewhere in the world. The builders of Machu Picchu transported stone onto a mountain ridge more than 2,400 meters above sea level, while the creators of Masada constructed extensive fortifications atop an isolated desert plateau. In both cases, modern researchers still debate the exact logistical methods employed. Smbata belongs in the same category. Archaeologists can study the finished fortress, but the detailed construction process remains largely unknown. The second mystery concerns measurement and planning. At first glance, the fortress appears to follow the irregular shape of the mountain. Closer examination reveals something more sophisticated. The walls do not simply wander across the landscape. They adapt carefully to the terrain while maintaining defensive effectiveness. This suggests that the builders possessed advanced surveying knowledge. Today, military engineers use satellite imagery, digital terrain models, GPS systems, and computer simulations to optimize defensive layouts. Medieval builders possessed none of these tools, yet they successfully designed fortifications that maximized visibility, minimized vulnerable approaches, and exploited natural rock formations. Researchers continue to ask how such planning was achieved. Did engineers create scale maps before construction began? Were geometric measurement systems used to establish defensive angles? How were long wall segments aligned across uneven terrain without modern instruments? Very few written records survive to answer these questions. Perhaps the most important mystery involves water. Throughout history, mountain fortresses often fell not because their walls were breached, but because their defenders ran out of water. A garrison can survive without resupply for weeks or months if sufficient water remains available. Evidence discovered at Smbata suggests the existence of sophisticated water storage systems. Archaeologists have identified cisterns and structures associated with collecting and preserving water. The question is whether these systems alone could have supported a large population during prolonged sieges. A single person requires several liters of water each day simply to survive, and a military force of several hundred defenders would require thousands of liters over extended periods. The storage capacity needed becomes enormous. Some researchers believe the fortress may have possessed additional hydraulic systems that no longer survive, while others suggest that rainwater harvesting played a larger role than previously assumed. Comparable mysteries exist at other fortified mountain sites. The Nabateans of Petra engineered elaborate channels and reservoirs in one of the driest regions of the Middle East, while the builders of Masada created massive cistern systems capable of storing large quantities of water collected from seasonal floods. Whether Smbata possessed a similarly sophisticated hydraulic network remains uncertain. Another mystery concerns durability. The Caucasus is one of the most geologically active regions in the world. Earthquakes have repeatedly affected Armenia throughout history. In addition, the fortress experiences severe winters, strong winds, temperature fluctuations, and freeze-thaw cycles, capable of damaging masonry. Yet significant portions of the walls remain standing centuries after construction. From an engineering perspective, this is remarkable. Modern material scientists often study ancient structures to understand long-term durability. Roman concrete continues to attract scientific attention because some harbour installations have survived nearly 2,000 years of exposure to seawater. Certain Inca stone structures demonstrate exceptional earthquake resistance despite lacking mortar. Sumbataberd presents a similar puzzle. Researchers continue investigating the composition of construction materials, the selection of stone types, and the possibility that builders employed structural techniques that improved resistance to environmental stress. Exactly how much practical engineering knowledge was embedded in these walls remains uncertain. One of the fortress's greatest advantages was visibility. From the summit, defenders could monitor large sections of the surrounding landscape, and approaching armies would have been visible long before reaching the fortress. This raises another fascinating possibility. Some historians believe Sumbataberd may have formed part of a larger communication network linking multiple strongholds across medieval Armenia. Signal systems using fire, smoke, mirrors or reflected sunlight have been documented throughout history. The Byzantine Empire employed beacon networks to transmit military warnings over hundreds of kilometers, and similar systems existed in ancient China and parts of the Islamic world. If comparable networks operated in Armenia, Sumbataberd would have occupied a strategically important position. The challenge is that physical evidence for communication systems rarely survives. Fire beacons leave little trace after centuries. As a result, archaeologists can identify the possibility, but cannot fully reconstruct how information moved across the region. Large fortresses require large resources. Construction demanded stone, timber, food, labor, transportation, and specialized skills. Maintaining the fortress required continuous support from surrounding communities. This creates an economic mystery. How large was the population responsible for sustaining Sumbataberd? How many workers participated in construction? How long did building projects continue? The answers remain uncertain because historical records are incomplete. Researchers estimate that major fortification projects elsewhere often required thousands of laborers. Medieval castles in Europe sometimes consumed years or even decades of coordinated effort. Similar demands likely existed at Sumbataberd. The fortress therefore represents not merely military architecture but evidence of a complex regional economy capable of organizing large-scale projects in a mountainous environment. The final mystery may be the most important. The builders of Sumbataberd clearly understood surveying, logistics, defensive architecture, water management, and construction in difficult terrain. Their achievements remain visible in stone. What has largely disappeared is the knowledge behind those achievements. No detailed engineering manuals explain how measurements were taken. No surviving documents describe the exact construction sequence. No records reveal how builders calculated wall alignments, optimized defensive fields of view, or solved transportation challenges on steep mountain slopes. This pattern appears throughout history. What do you think was the greatest secret behind Sumbataberd Fortress? Its construction, its water system, or the lost engineering knowledge of its builders? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Few monuments from the Stone Age raise more engineering questions than Menhir de Champdolent. Standing near Dol de Bretagne in northwestern France, this gigantic monolithic stone rises approximately 9.4 meters above the ground and weighs an estimated 100 to 125 tons. Unlike pyramids, temples, or fortresses, it consists of only a single block of granite. Yet that simplicity creates one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries. Researchers believe the monument was erected sometime during the Neolithic period, likely between 4500 and 2500 BC. No written records exist, no construction plans survive, and no inscriptions explain its purpose. All that remains is a colossal stone that has stood for thousands of years, silently challenging modern assumptions about prehistoric engineering. The discovery of the monument itself was never dramatic. Local communities had known of its existence for centuries. Medieval legends claimed that the stone would gradually sink into the earth until the end of the world. Antiquarians began documenting it during the 18th and 19th centuries, and modern archaeological surveys later confirmed its significance as one of the largest standing stones in Europe. Yet despite centuries of observation, some of the most important questions remain unanswered. The first most obvious mystery involves transportation. Moving a stone weighing over 100 tons is difficult even with modern machinery. Today engineers rely on cranes, hydraulic systems, specialised transport vehicles, and precise computer calculations. But the builders of Champdolent possessed none of these technologies. Geological studies indicate that the monument is composed of local granite. However, the exact quarry remains uncertain. Even if the source was only a few kilometres away, transporting such a mass would have been an extraordinary undertaking. Experimental archaeologists have attempted to recreate megalith transport using technologies available during the Neolithic period. These experiments demonstrate that large stones can be moved using wooden rollers, sledges, ropes made from plant fibres, and coordinated human labour. Yet the scale involved at Champdolent introduces additional complications. A 120-ton stone creates enormous friction against the ground. Every slope becomes a major obstacle, and every change in direction increases the risk of catastrophic failure. The builders would have needed to understand terrain, weight distribution, rope strength, and mechanical advantage at a surprisingly sophisticated level. The challenge becomes even greater when compared with other famous megalithic monuments. Some of the largest stones at Stonehenge weigh around 25 tons. Several blocks used in passage tombs throughout Western Europe range between 30 and 50 tons, and the largest stones transported for the Egyptian pyramids often exceeded 60 tons. Champdolent belongs to an elite category of prehistoric monuments that required moving masses approaching or exceeding 100 tons. Such projects demand logistical capabilities far beyond what many people traditionally associate with Stone Age societies. Transporting the stone may not have been the most difficult part. Raising it into a vertical position may have been even more challenging. A monolith nearly 10 meters tall behaves very differently from a stone lying flat on the ground. As the stone is lifted, its center of gravity shifts continuously. Small errors can generate massive forces capable of snapping ropes, collapsing wooden supports, or causing the entire monument to fall. Modern engineering calculations show that large standing structures remain stable only when several conditions are satisfied simultaneously. The foundation must support the load, the center of mass must remain within safe limits, and the surrounding soil must resist long-term movement. Champdolent has remained standing for several millennia. This durability suggests that its builders understood principles they could never have expressed mathematically. They may not have possessed formal engineering equations, but they clearly understood stability through observation and accumulated experience. Researchers still debate exactly how the stone was erected. Some propose massive earthen ramps, others suggest systems of ropes and timber frameworks, and another possibility involves gradually lowering the base into a prepared pit while controlling the descent with coordinated pulling teams. No direct archaeological evidence has confirmed which method was used. One of the least discussed mysteries concerns the stone itself. Granite may appear simple, but selecting the wrong block could doom an entire project. Natural stone often contains fractures invisible from the surface, and internal weaknesses can remain hidden until transportation begins. A single crack developing under stress could destroy years of labour. Yet the builders selected a stone capable of surviving thousands of years of weathering. This achievement raises important questions. How did Neolithic quarry workers identify suitable granite? How did they evaluate structural integrity without modern geological tools? Did they possess specialized knowledge passed through generations of stoneworkers? The situation resembles other ancient engineering puzzles. Roman builders developed concrete mixtures whose remarkable durability still attracts scientific investigation today. The engineers of Machu Picchu created masonry capable of resisting earthquakes, and ancient Egyptian stoneworkers shaped granite with astonishing precision. Champdolent may represent another example of practical expertise that was never recorded and has largely disappeared. The monument's size creates another puzzle. Constructing a standing stone of this scale required tremendous effort. Hundreds of workers may have participated, large quantities of food would have been needed to support the labour force, and planning and coordination likely extended over long periods. Why invest such resources in a single stone? One possibility is territorial symbolism, with the monument marking an important boundary visible from great distances. Another theory proposes a ceremonial purpose. Throughout Neolithic Europe, monuments often served as gathering places for ritual activities, seasonal events, or social ceremonies. A third hypothesis suggests a political function. Large monuments can demonstrate power, unity, and organizational capability, and the very act of construction may have been as important as the finished structure. The difficulty is that no definitive evidence supports any single explanation. Unlike tombs, the monument contains no human burials. Unlike temples, it preserves no obvious architectural features. Unlike settlements, it reveals little about everyday life. The stone stands alone, and its silence remains one of its greatest mysteries. Today, Champdolent appears relatively isolated. However, many researchers suspect that the monument may once have belonged to a much larger prehistoric landscape. Across Brittany, thousands of megaliths were erected during the Neolithic period. The famous alignments of Karnak include approximately 3,000 standing stones distributed across several kilometres, while numerous dolmens, passage tombs, and ceremonial sites are scattered throughout the region. This concentration of monuments suggests extensive cultural networks capable of coordinating large-scale construction projects. If Champdolent originally formed part of a broader system, much of that context may have vanished through erosion, agriculture, urban development, and the passage of time. The loss of surrounding evidence makes interpretation significantly more difficult, and researchers may be examining only a fragment of a much larger prehistoric design. Many megalithic sites throughout Europe demonstrate potential astronomical alignments. Stonehenge is famously associated with solstitial observations. Newgrange in Ireland aligns with a winter solstice sunrise, and other monuments appear connected to lunar cycles or seasonal events. Could Champdolent have served a similar purpose? The question remains controversial. Some researchers have proposed possible alignments with landscape features or celestial events, while others argue that current evidence is insufficient and may simply reflect coincidence. Without additional associated structures, determining intentional astronomical design becomes extremely difficult, yet the possibility cannot be completely dismissed. Many prehistoric societies possessed surprisingly sophisticated observational knowledge of the sky, developed through centuries of careful tracking of seasonal patterns. If Champdolent played a role in such observations, the details have been lost. Rising above the barren plains of Karakalpakstan in modern-day Uzbekistan, this circular fortress-like monument stands atop a steep natural hill overlooking the lower Amu Darya region. Archaeologists generally date the structure to between the 1st and 4th centuries AD, during the flourishing era of the ancient Khwarezm civilization. Yet despite decades of research, many of the engineering decisions behind its construction remain unexplained. Why was such a massive circular structure built on an isolated hill? How did ancient builders transport thousands of construction materials to the summit? And perhaps most intriguingly, how has the monument survived nearly 2,000 years of extreme environmental exposure? The site first attracted scholarly attention during the late 19th and early 20th centuries as Russian explorers and archaeologists began documenting the archaeological landscape of Khwarezm. More systematic investigations followed during the Soviet period, particularly through the Khwarezm Archaeological and Ethnographic Expedition led by Sergei Tolstov beginning in 1937. Surveys revealed that Chilpik was unlike most other monuments in the region. Measuring approximately 65 meters in diameter, the circular enclosure sits atop a hill rising roughly 35 to 40 meters above the surrounding terrain. Its commanding position immediately suggested strategic importance, but its true purpose remains debated even today. The first mystery concerns location. Ancient builders throughout history often selected elevated terrain for defensive purposes, religious symbolism, or visibility. Yet Chilpik appears unusually isolated. Constructing a large circular enclosure on a steep hill would have dramatically increased labor requirements. Every construction material had to be transported upward without wheeled machinery, cranes, or modern lifting equipment. Archaeologists estimate that even a modest structure of this scale would have required thousands of individual mud bricks. Similar logistical challenges are often discussed in relation to Machu Picchu in Peru or the hilltop fortresses of the Caucasus. In each case, researchers are left asking the same question: what organizational systems allowed ancient societies to mobilize labor so efficiently? The geometry of the structure introduces another puzzle. The outer wall forms an almost perfect circle despite being constructed on uneven terrain. Producing accurate circular plans without modern surveying instruments requires a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of measurement. Ancient Egyptian surveyors achieved remarkable precision while laying out pyramid complexes. Roman engineers developed advanced methods for road construction and city planning. Yet, very little is known about the surveying techniques used by Khwarezmian builders. The precision visible at Chilpik suggests that they possessed practical geometric knowledge that is largely absent from surviving written records. Most scholars identify Chilpik as a dakma, or Tower of Silence, associated with the Zoroastrian religion. According to traditional Zoroastrian practice, corpses were not buried or cremated because both earth and fire were considered sacred elements that should not be polluted by human remains. Instead, bodies were exposed to scavenging birds in elevated locations where natural processes could accelerate decomposition. On the surface, this explanation appears straightforward. However, closer examination reveals a remarkably sophisticated environmental system. For such a ritual to function efficiently, multiple environmental variables must align. The location requires strong sunlight, low humidity, effective drainage, consistent airflow, and reliable access for carrion birds. Modern ecological studies demonstrate that decomposition rates vary significantly depending on temperature, solar radiation, wind exposure, and local scavenger populations. Chilpik appears positioned in a location that maximizes many of these factors simultaneously. This raises an intriguing possibility. Were the builders simply following religious tradition, or did they possess generations of accumulated environmental knowledge, allowing them to optimize decomposition processes through careful site selection? The answer remains unknown. Another mystery involves the structure's actual purpose. Although widely interpreted as a dakma, some researchers have questioned whether the monument may have served additional functions. From a distance, Chilpik resembles a defensive tower or fortress. Its elevated position provides extensive visibility across the surrounding landscape. Throughout history, elevated circular structures have often fulfilled military roles. Similar debates surround numerous ancient monuments where archaeological evidence suggests multiple phases of occupation. It is possible that Chilpic's function evolved over centuries, transforming from one use to another as political and religious conditions changed. Unfortunately, the surviving evidence remains insufficient to settle the question conclusively. The most fascinating mystery of all concerns the durability of its construction materials. This is where Chilpic becomes especially important from an engineering perspective. At first glance, the monument appears relatively simple. Unlike Roman concrete structures or Egyptian stone temples, it was built primarily from mud brick and local materials. Such materials are generally considered vulnerable to erosion. Modern adobe structures often require continuous maintenance because wind, rain, temperature fluctuations, and salt crystallization gradually weaken earthen walls. Yet Chilpic has survived for nearly 2 millennia in one of the harshest environmental settings imaginable. The climate of the lower Amu Darya region presents a severe challenge to any construction material. Summer temperatures frequently exceed 40 degrees Celsius. Winter temperatures can fall well below freezing. Seasonal thermal expansion and contraction place constant stress on masonry. Strong winds carry abrasive dust particles capable of slowly eroding exposed surfaces. In addition, salts present in arid soils can migrate through porous materials and crystallize, gradually causing structural deterioration. Under such conditions, many ancient mud brick structures have disappeared almost entirely, yet significant portions of Chilpic's circular enclosure remain recognizable after approximately 1,700 to 2,000 years of exposure. This survival raises important questions about the original construction technology. Researchers studying ancient earthen architecture have discovered that seemingly simple mud bricks often conceal surprisingly sophisticated engineering. The ratio of clay to sand can dramatically affect strength. Organic additives such as straw, reeds, or plant fibers can reduce cracking. Variations in moisture content influence shrinkage during drying. Some ancient builders intentionally selected specific soil compositions to maximize durability. Experimental archaeology has shown that small changes in material recipes can produce major differences in long-term performance. The problem is that the exact formula used at Chilpic remains uncertain. Archaeologists can analyze surviving fragments, but erosion and centuries of weathering complicate efforts to reconstruct original material properties. Did Khwarezmian builders discover particularly effective combinations of clay and aggregate? Did they apply protective surface treatments now lost to time? Were construction techniques passed through generations of craftsmen whose knowledge eventually disappeared? Recent scientific techniques have provided valuable insights but not complete answers. Satellite imagery, drone mapping, geochemical analysis, and microscopic examination of construction materials have all expanded our understanding of the site. Yet these technologies can reveal only the final product. They cannot fully reconstruct the decisions, experiments, and accumulated experience that allowed ancient builders to achieve such results.